Harry Potter had always known that his life was different, but he had never imagined just how different until the summer he turned 9. The revelation came on a sweltering July afternoon when Aunt Petunia, in one of her more vindictive moods, decided that the attic needed a thorough cleaning before the annual neighborhood watch meeting at their house. You see, where are you watching this story unfold from today? The tale I'm about to tell you might seem impossible, but in the magical world, the impossible happens more often than you'd think. Drop a comment and let me know what corner of the world you're listening from as we dive into what might be the most shocking discovery in wizarding history. The cupboard under the stairs had been Harry's bedroom for as long as he could remember, but today it would serve as his prison. Aunt Petunia had shoved him up into the dusty, cobweb-laden attic space with strict instructions to sort through decades of accumulated junk. The heat was oppressive, and the single bare bulb cast eerie shadows across piles of forgotten Christmas decorations, mouldy books, and broken furniture. Harry wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of dust across his too-thin face. His cousin Dudley was probably downstairs eating ice cream and watching television, while Harry suffered in the stifling heat above. It wasn't fair, but then again, nothing in Harry's life had ever been fair. The Dursleys made sure of that every single day. As he sorted through a pile of Vernon's old business documents, something peculiar caught his eye. Wedged behind a stack of accounting ledgers was an ornate wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case, that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. The wood appeared to shift colors in the dim light, cycling between deep mahogany and rich ebony, with veins of what looked like silver running through it. Harry had never seen anything like it in the Dursleys' house. They prided themselves on their absolute normalcy, their aggressive ordinariness. This box was anything but ordinary. The moment his fingers made contact with its surface, Harry felt a warm, tingling sensation race up his arms, and the box made a soft clicking sound, as if recognizing his touch. The lid opened with surprising ease, revealing contents that made Harry's breath catch in his throat. Inside, nestled in what appeared to be red velvet that showed no signs of age or wear, were several documents tied with a ribbon that gleamed like spun gold. Beneath the papers lay a small silver key that seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and at the bottom of the box, a folded letter with his name written across it in handwriting he didn't recognize, but somehow felt familiar. With trembling fingers, Harry lifted out the first document. It was heavy parchment, far finer than any paper he had ever seen, and across the top in elegant script were the words, "Last Will and Testament of James Charles Potter." Harry's heart began to pound so hard he was certain it could be heard throughout the house. His father had left a will. His father, who according to the Dursleys had been a drunk and a layabout, had owned enough to require legal documentation. The second document bore his mother's name, Lily Evans Potter, and appeared to be some sort of financial record. The third made Harry's hands shake so violently he nearly dropped it. It was a contract, bearing official seals and signatures, designating Albus Dumbledore as Harry's temporary magical guardian, with very specific limitations on his authority. The contract was clear that Dumbledore's guardianship was meant to be temporary, lasting only until suitable permanent arrangements could be made, and that under no circumstances was he authorized to make financial decisions regarding Harry's inheritance without explicit written consent from designated Potter family solicitors. But it was the fourth document that changed everything. It was a detailed financial statement from something called Gringotts Wizarding Bank, dated just 3 months ago, showing transactions in Harry's name. The numbers were staggering. Withdrawals of thousands of galleons, whatever those were, marked as educational expenses and guardian fees. The account showed a balance that made Harry dizzy just looking at it, but the withdrawal amounts were even more shocking. According to these records, Albus Dumbledore had been systematically draining Harry's inheritance for years, taking far more than any reasonable educational expenses could justify. The most recent withdrawal was marked as a payment to Vernon and Petunia Dursley for Harry's care, an amount so large it represented more money than Vernon made in several years at his drill company. Harry's hands were shaking now for an entirely different reason. The Dursleys were being paid to keep him, paid handsomely, yet they treated him like an unwanted burden. They fed him scraps while dining lavishly themselves, dressed him in Dudley's oversized cast-offs while buying his cousin expensive clothes, and locked him in a cupboard while Dudley enjoyed a bedroom larger than most people's living rooms. The letter with his name proved to be the final piece of the puzzle. Written in his father's hand, it was addressed to Harry himself, to be opened when he came of age or in case of emergency. The words swam before Harry's eyes as rage began to build in his chest. My dearest son, if you are reading this, then Lily and I are gone, and something has gone terribly wrong with the arrangements we made for your care. We trusted Albus Dumbledore to ensure your safety, but we also put safeguards in place in case that trust proved misplaced. You should be living with loving relatives or guardians, attending the finest magical schools, and wanting for nothing. If this is not the case, then someone has betrayed that trust. The box you found was keyed to your magical signature and hidden by the strongest protective charms we could manage. Inside, you will find evidence of your true inheritance and the legal means to reclaim it. We have ensured that should anything happen to us, you would have recourse through the Goblin Nation, whose laws supersede wizarding law in matters of theft and contract violation. Seek out Griphook at Gringotts Bank. Show him the silver key and these documents. The goblins have no love for wizarding corruption, and will help you reclaim what is rightfully yours. Trust no wizard completely, Harry, but the goblins honor their contracts above all else. If Dumbledore or anyone else has stolen from you, betrayed you, or failed in their duty to protect and provide for you, the goblins will see justice done. You are the last of the Potter line, and our family has ancient treaties with the Goblin Nation that guarantee their protection and legal assistance. Be brave, my son. Be smart. And remember that sometimes the most dangerous enemies wear the faces of friends. All our love, James and Lily Potter Harry read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. Dumbledore, the wizard the magical world apparently revered as their savior and champion, had been stealing from him for years. The man who had left him with the Dursleys, knowing they would abuse and neglect him, had been taking money meant for Harry's care and education, while Harry lived in a cupboard and ate table scraps. The rage that had been building in Harry's chest suddenly exploded outward in a way he had never experienced before. The bare light bulb above his head began to flicker wildly, then blazed so brightly it should have burned out. The documents in his hands began to glow with a soft, protective light, and throughout the attic every piece of metal began to vibrate with an ominous humming sound. But the most shocking thing was what happened to one particular document. As Harry's anger focused on the contract bearing Dumbledore's signature, that signature began to smoke and blacken. The ink seemed to writhe on the page as if alive, and slowly, letter by letter, Dumbledore's name burned away while leaving the rest of the document untouched. Harry stared at the phenomenon in wonder and terror. He had made magic happen, real magic, directed by his will and his fury. The signature of a man who had betrayed him was literally burning under the force of his rage. The sound of the front door slamming downstairs broke through Harry's magical fugue. The Dursleys were returning from their afternoon out, and Harry could hear Dudley's whining voice complaining about something. Soon they would expect him to come down and prepare dinner, and then he would be locked back in his cupboard like some unwanted pet. But not today. Today, everything had changed. Harry carefully gathered the documents and placed them back in the magical box. The silver key went into his pocket, where it felt warm against his leg. The box itself seemed to shrink slightly in his hands, becoming small enough to hide easily under his loose shirt. As he climbed down from the attic, Harry's mind was racing with possibilities. He had money, real money, enough to change his life forever. He had legal grounds to pursue justice against those who had wronged him. And most importantly, he had allies in the Goblin nation who apparently owed his family loyalty and protection. But first, he had to get to this Gringotts Bank, wherever it was. Dinner that evening was a tense affair, though the Dursleys had no idea why. Harry served the meal mechanically, his mind occupied with planning his escape. He needed to get to London, he reasoned. Banks were usually in big cities, and London was the only big city he knew about. The problem was that he had no money for the journey, no identification, and no idea where exactly to go once he arrived. The solution came to him as he was washing dishes while listening to Vernon boast about a business deal. Harry had been practicing small acts of magic for years without realizing it, making things happen when he was emotional or desperate. If he could burn away Dumbledore's signature with pure will, what else might he be able to do? That night, as the Dursleys settled in front of the television, Harry lay in his cupboard and planned. He would leave tomorrow morning while they were at Dudley's dentist appointment. He would find a way to get to London, and then he would find Gringotts Bank and demand answers. But first, he needed to test something. Concentrating on the small space around him, Harry focused on the feeling he had experienced in the attic when his magic had responded to his anger. He thought about the injustices he had suffered, the money that should have made his life comfortable, the lies he had been told about his parents. The cupboard door, which the Dursleys always locked from the outside, made a soft clicking sound as the latch disengaged. Harry smiled in the darkness. If he could unlock doors with his mind, getting to London would be the least of his problems. The harder question was what he would do once he found the people responsible for stealing his inheritance and condemning him to a life of abuse. As he drifted off to sleep, still clutching the magical box, Harry Potter began to dream of justice. He dreamed of goblins and banks and legal documents that would make powerful wizards answer for their crimes. He dreamed of a life where he had enough food to eat, proper clothes to wear, and people who cared about his well-being. Most of all, he dreamed of the moment when he would look Albus Dumbledore in the eye and demand to know why the great wizard had betrayed a child who had trusted him. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and for the first time in his life, Harry Potter woke up with hope. He had a plan, he had legal backing, and he had magic of his own that was apparently far stronger than anyone had imagined. The wizarding world had taken advantage of an orphaned child for the last time. As he heard the Dursleys preparing for their outing, Harry began his own preparations. He dressed in his least oversized clothes, hid the magical box securely under his shirt, and made sure the silver key was safe in his pocket. By the time Vernon started the car, Harry was ready to change his life forever. The moment the car disappeared around the corner, Harry walked out of Privet Drive for what he intended to be the last time. He had no clear plan for getting to London, but he had magic and determination, and a righteous fury that seemed to make impossible things happen. Within 3 blocks of the house, a passing motorist stopped and offered him a ride, claiming later that something had simply compelled him to help the small boy walking alone. Within an hour, Harry found himself standing outside King's Cross Station in London, with the helpful stranger insisting on buying him a train ticket to anywhere he needed to go. Harry had asked for Diagon Alley, not really expecting the man to know where it was. But to his surprise, the stranger nodded knowingly and directed him to a small, shabby-looking pub called the Leaky Cauldron that Harry was certain he had never seen before, despite standing directly in front of it. The moment Harry crossed the threshold, he knew he had found the magical world his parents had belonged to. The pub was full of people in robes and pointed hats, and conversation stopped as patrons noticed the small, dark-haired boy standing in the doorway. Harry ignored the stares and approached the bar, where a nearly bald man was cleaning glasses with a rag that seemed to clean them by itself. "I need to get to Gringotts Bank," Harry said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The barman, who introduced himself as Tom, looked Harry up and down with sharp eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "You're a bit young to be doing business with the goblins on your own, aren't you, lad?" Harry pulled out the silver key, which began to glow the moment it touched the air of the magical pub. The barman's eyes widened as he recognized whatever the key represented. "Blimey," Tom whispered. Right then, through the back courtyard and up Diagon Alley. You can't miss it. The big white building with all the bronze doors. Mind yourself with the goblins, young sir. They don't much care for wizards, but they respect their own laws above all else. Diagon Alley was everything Harry had never dared to imagine. Shops sold wands and cauldrons, books that moved their own pages, and owls that delivered mail. Children his own age walked with their parents, pointing excitedly at displays of magical sweets and toys. It was a world of wonder and possibility, and Harry realized with growing anger that this should have been his world all along. Gringotts Bank was impossible to miss. The building towered over the surrounding shops, its white marble walls gleaming in the afternoon sun. Bronze doors larger than houses stood open, and carved above the entrance was a warning that made Harry smile grimly. "Enter, stranger, but take heed of what awaits the sin of greed, for those who take, but do not earn, must pay most dearly in their turn. So if you seek beneath our floors a treasure that was never yours, thief, you have been warned, beware of finding more than treasure there." Harry had not come to steal. He had come to reclaim what was already his, and to make sure that those who had stolen from him faced the justice they deserved. The goblin who greeted him inside was tall for his species, with intelligent dark eyes and sharp features that suggested he missed very little. Harry approached his desk with the silver key held out before him. "My name is Harry Potter," he said clearly. "I believe this key belongs to me, and I think someone has been stealing from my inheritance." The goblin's eyes fixed on the key, then travelled to Harry's face. His expression shifted from professional courtesy to something approaching respect, mixed with surprise. "Indeed, Mr. Potter," the goblin said, in a voice like gravel and silver. "I am Griphook, and I have been wondering when you would come to us. We have been waiting quite some time to have a conversation about your account." Harry felt a fierce satisfaction settle in his chest. He had found the right place, and he was about to get the answers he deserved. The game, as they say, was about to begin. And in that moment, as Harry Potter prepared to take his first real step toward justice and independence, the magical world was about to discover that the boy who lived was also the boy who would no longer accept being cheated, lied to, or betrayed. The revolution was about to begin, and it would start with a 9-year-old boy, a silver key, and a demand for justice that would shake the wizarding world to its very foundations. The invitation that would transform Harry Potter from a domestic reformer into a global revolutionary arrived on a crisp November morning, delivered by an owl bearing the official seal of the International Confederation of Wizards. The parchment, inscribed in multiple languages and sealed with magical protections that testified to its importance, contained a request that no wizard in living memory had ever received at such a young age. "Lord Potter," the formal invitation read, "The International Confederation of Wizards cordially requests your presence as the keynote speaker at our annual assembly to address the gathered representatives of 47 magical governments on the subject of institutional reform and child protection in magical society. Your unique experience and demonstrated success in transforming systemic corruption make your perspective invaluable to our ongoing efforts to improve magical governance worldwide." Harry stood in the renovated library of Grimmauld Place, surrounded by members of Potter's Guard who had gathered for their regular morning briefing, and felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. This was not simply an invitation to give a speech. It was recognition that his local victory over corruption had implications that extended far beyond the borders of magical Britain, and that the international magical community was looking to him for leadership on issues that affected magical beings throughout the world. The assembly would be held in Geneva, at the International Magical Cooperation Center, and would bring together the most powerful magical leaders from every inhabited continent, ministers of magic, supreme mugwumps, chief warlocks, and their equivalents from magical governments as diverse as the Australian Magical Council and the Brazilian Ministry of Magical Affairs would all be present to hear what the 10-year-old boy who had brought down Albus Dumbledore had to say about the future of magical governance. But this invitation represented more than just international recognition of Harry's achievements. It was also an opportunity to expand his reform movement beyond the boundaries of any single magical nation, and to establish principles of justice and accountability that could be applied universally. The speech Harry would deliver in Geneva had the potential to reshape how magical societies throughout the world understood their responsibilities to their most vulnerable members, particularly magical children who depended on adult protection and guidance. As Harry began preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most important speech of his life, he drew on resources and perspectives that no previous magical leader had ever possessed. His multi-species alliances provided him with insights into how magical governance affected beings who were typically excluded from political power. His experience as a victim of systematic abuse gave him credibility when discussing child protection that no amount of theoretical knowledge could match. Most importantly, his practical success in reforming magical institutions provided concrete examples that other magical leaders could adapt to their own circumstances and challenges. The preparation process for Harry's international debut revealed just how extensive his network of allies and advisors had become. Representatives from magical governments throughout Europe arrived at Grimmauld Place to offer their perspectives on the issues that would be addressed at the assembly. Marie Delacour, the French Minister of Magic and mother of the famous Triwizard champion, brought evidence of corruption scandals that had plagued magical France for decades. Her government was facing challenges remarkably similar to what Harry had confronted in Britain, including evidence of systematic financial theft from magical orphans and deliberate suppression of magically powerful children who might have challenged established authority. Klaus Zimmermann, representing the German Magical Council, provided documentation of educational reforms that had been inspired by Harry's alternative schooling programs. Several German magical institutions had already begun implementing curricula that emphasized critical thinking and moral reasoning rather than simple obedience to authority, and the results were exceeding all expectations. Most significantly, representatives from magical communities that had never before been invited to participate in international magical governance arrived to share their perspectives and experiences. The African Federation of Magical Nations, the Indigenous Magical Councils of the Americas, and the Asian Confederation of Magical States all sent delegates who brought entirely different approaches to magical education, child protection, and community governance. These international consultations revealed that the problems Harry had identified and addressed in Britain were far more widespread than anyone had previously understood. Corruption, abuse of power, and systematic oppression of vulnerable magical beings were common features of magical societies throughout the world, though they took different forms and operated through different institutions in different cultures. The speech that emerged from these collaborative discussions was unlike anything that had ever been presented to the International Confederation of Wizards. Rather than focusing on abstract theoretical principles or diplomatic generalities, Harry's address would present concrete proposals for reform, backed by practical examples of successful implementation. The central theme of his presentation would be the concept of magical society as a covenant between the powerful and the vulnerable, with specific obligations and accountability mechanisms that could be applied across cultural and national boundaries. When the day of the assembly arrived, Harry's journey to Geneva was itself a statement about his commitment to inclusive representation. Rather than traveling alone or with a small entourage of human advisors, he brought a delegation that included representatives from every major magical species, and several that had never before participated in international magical politics. Bloodbane and several senior Goblin diplomats accompanied him as financial and legal advisors, their presence a reminder that Goblin law had been instrumental in exposing the corruption that Harry's reforms had addressed. Firenze and other Centaur representatives joined the delegation as philosophical counselors and long-term strategic thinkers, their perspectives on natural cycles and historical patterns providing context that purely human analysis often missed. Even house elves, traditionally excluded from political participation entirely, were included in Harry's delegation as experts on service ethics and the proper relationship between those who hold power and those who enable its exercise. The reaction to Harry's arrival at the International Magical Cooperation Centre was everything his supporters had hoped for, and more than his critics had feared. The gathered magical leaders, accustomed to dealing with diplomats and politicians whose authority derived from institutional position rather than personal achievement, found themselves confronting a 10-year-old boy whose moral authority was based on proven success in fighting exactly the kinds of corruption that many of their own governments struggled with. Harry's appearance had been carefully planned to convey both respect for the dignity of the assembly and confidence in his own right to be there. He wore formal robes that had been crafted by Goblin tailors using techniques that produced garments, both elegant and protective, their subtle magical properties serving as a reminder that he possessed resources and allies that extended far beyond traditional diplomatic channels. But it was Harry's demeanor that truly impressed the assembled delegates. This was not a child playing at adult responsibilities or a prodigy showing off his precocious abilities. This was a young leader who understood the gravity of the issues being discussed and possessed both the knowledge and the moral authority necessary to address them effectively. The speech itself was a masterpiece of moral clarity and practical wisdom that would be remembered as one of the most important addresses in the history of international magical cooperation. "Honored delegates," Harry began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the vast assembly hall without magical amplification, "I stand before you today, not as a representative of any single magical government, but as someone who has experienced firsthand both the failures of our current systems and the possibilities that emerge when those systems are reformed according to principles of justice and accountability." The opening of his address established the themes that would run throughout his presentation: the universal nature of the problems affecting magical societies, the moral imperative to protect those who could not protect themselves, and the practical possibility of creating institutions that served justice rather than simply preserving existing power relationships. Harry's discussion of child protection in magical society was particularly powerful because it drew on his own experiences while avoiding the kind of personal details that would have been inappropriate for a diplomatic setting. Instead, he focused on the systemic factors that enabled abuse and the institutional changes that could prevent it from occurring in the future. "The evidence I will present today demonstrates that magical children throughout the world face similar vulnerabilities, and that the adults responsible for their protection often fail in their duties for remarkably similar reasons," Harry explained, as magical charts and documents appeared in the air above the assembly hall. The presentation that followed was devastating in its comprehensiveness and precision. Harry and his team had compiled evidence from dozens of magical societies showing patterns of corruption, abuse, and systematic oppression that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. In magical Britain, powerful wizards used their authority to steal from orphaned children and manipulate their development to serve adult political agendas. In magical France, similar patterns of financial exploitation were combined with educational practices that deliberately suppressed critical thinking and independent judgment. In magical Germany, systematic discrimination against magical creatures was used to maintain wizard supremacy, while denying basic rights to beings whose abilities and contributions were essential to magical society. But Harry's presentation was not simply a catalogue of problems and failures. The second half of his address focused on practical solutions that had already been successfully implemented, providing the assembled delegates with concrete examples they could adapt to their own circumstances. The alternative educational programs Harry had established in Britain were already being replicated in several other magical societies, with modifications that reflected local conditions and cultural preferences. The multi-species approach to magical law enforcement that Potter's Guard represented was inspiring similar experiments in countries where traditional wizard-only institutions had proven inadequate for maintaining justice and security. Most importantly, the financial oversight and transparency requirements that had been implemented in Britain following the exposure of Dumbledore's crimes were being adopted by magical governments throughout Europe as tools for preventing similar corruption in their own institutions. The response to Harry's presentation was unprecedented in the history of the International Confederation of Wizards. Rather than the polite diplomatic applause that typically followed such addresses, Harry received a sustained standing ovation from delegates who recognized that they had witnessed something genuinely transformative. But more than emotional response, Harry's speech generated concrete commitments to reform that would reshape international magical cooperation for generations to come. 17 magical governments formally requested assistance in implementing versions of Harry's educational reforms in their own societies. 23 countries committed to adopting the financial transparency standards that had been developed in Britain. Most significantly, the entire Assembly voted to establish new international standards for child protection in magical society, with enforcement mechanisms that would make it impossible for future abuses to be hidden or ignored. The establishment of these international standards represented the culmination of Harry's transformation, from a victim seeking personal justice to a leader working for systemic change that would benefit magical children throughout the world. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Harry's international debut was the series of bilateral meetings and negotiations that followed his formal address. Magical leaders from around the world requested private consultations to discuss how his reform principles could be adapted to their specific circumstances and challenges. The President of the Magical Congress of the United States arrived with evidence of corruption scandals involving the exploitation of Native American magical communities and requested assistance in developing reconciliation and reform processes that could address centuries of systematic oppression. The Chief Warlock of the Australian Magical Parliament brought documentation of discriminatory practices against Aboriginal magical practitioners and sought guidance on establishing inclusive educational programs that could bridge cultural divides while maintaining traditional knowledge systems. Most dramatically, the Supreme Mugwump of the South African Magical Assembly requested emergency assistance in addressing a crisis involving the systematic abuse of magical children in government-run institutions, a situation that bore disturbing similarities to what Harry himself had experienced at the hands of his supposed protectors. Each of these consultations revealed new dimensions of the problems that Harry's movement was addressing, and new opportunities for expanding his influence and impact beyond the boundaries of any single magical society. But the international attention and recognition also created new challenges and responsibilities that would test Harry's leadership abilities in ways he had never experienced before. The most immediate challenge came from magical leaders who saw Harry's growing international influence as a threat to their own authority and interests. A coalition of conservative magical governments, led by supremacist factions that had maintained power through the same kinds of corrupt practices that Harry had exposed in Britain, began organizing their own response to what they characterized as dangerous radicalism that threatened the stability of magical society. These opponents could not directly challenge Harry's moral authority or the success of his reforms, but they could attempt to undermine his international relationships and limit the spread of his influence through economic pressure, diplomatic manipulation, and covert sabotage. The first major test of Harry's ability to operate on the international stage came when several Eastern European magical governments, still dominated by dark wizard sympathizers and corrupt officials, announced their intention to withdraw from international cooperation agreements rather than submit to the transparency and accountability standards that Harry's movement represented. Their defection threatened to create a bloc of magical societies where corruption and abuse could continue unchecked, potentially undermining the progress that had been made elsewhere and creating safe havens for the kinds of criminals and supremacists that Harry's reforms were designed to combat. Harry's response to this challenge demonstrated the strategic thinking and diplomatic skills that his education in political leadership had developed. Rather than attempting to force compliance through economic sanctions or political pressure, he focused on creating positive incentives that would make participation in the reformed international system more attractive than isolation. The Potter Foundation's international programs offered educational exchanges, technical assistance, and financial support to magical societies that committed to implementing child protection and transparency standards. Countries that participated in these programs gained access to resources and expertise that could accelerate their own development and reform processes. Most effectively, Harry's international network of allies provided alternative sources of magical cooperation and commerce that reduced the economic and political leverage that corrupt governments had traditionally used to maintain their positions. The results of this strategy were swift and decisive. Within months of the Geneva Assembly, several of the governments that had initially threatened withdrawal were requesting readmission to international cooperation programs, acknowledging that isolation from the reformed magical community was more costly than compliance with its standards. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Harry's international activities was his growing relationship with Daphne Greengrass, who had accompanied him to Geneva as both a political advisor and personal companion. Their relationship, which had begun as intellectual partnership and mutual respect, was deepening into something more personal and emotionally significant as they worked together on projects that would shape their adult lives and careers. Daphne's contributions to Harry's international success were substantial and multifaceted. Her analytical intelligence helped him understand the political dynamics and cultural nuances that affected magical societies throughout the world. Her diplomatic skills smoothed relationships with foreign magical leaders who might have been intimidated by Harry's reputation or suspicious of his motives. Most importantly, her emotional support and partnership provided Harry with the kind of personal stability and companionship that enabled him to handle the enormous pressures and responsibilities that came with his position as an international leader. Their relationship was complicated by their age and the extraordinary circumstances that surrounded their lives, but it was also strengthened by shared values, complementary abilities, and mutual respect that suggested a foundation strong enough to survive whatever challenges lay ahead. As they walked together through the gardens of the International Magical Cooperation Center after the conclusion of the Geneva Assembly, Harry and Daphne discussed their plans for the future with the kind of easy intimacy that had developed naturally from months of working together on projects that mattered deeply to both of them. "Harry," Daphne said, as they paused beside a fountain whose waters reflected the lights of the magical city around them, "what we accomplished here this week will change the lives of magical children throughout the world. That's something to be proud of, but it's also a responsibility that will shape everything we do for the rest of our lives." Harry considered her words carefully, understanding that she was not simply commenting on their recent success, but asking him to think about what kind of future they wanted to build together and what role their personal relationship might play in that larger vision. "I know," he replied, with the kind of serious consideration that had become characteristic of his approach to important decisions. "But I also know that having you as a partner makes all of this seem possible rather than overwhelming. Whatever challenges we face in the future, I want to face them together." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bloodbane, who brought news that would test their partnership and their commitment to the principles that had guided their work together. "Lord Potter," the Goblin diplomat said, with the formal courtesy that marked all of his interactions with Harry, "we have received intelligence regarding a planned terrorist attack against the Potter Foundation's international headquarters. The threat appears to be credible and immediate, and we recommend that you return to Britain immediately." The news that dark wizards and corrupt officials were planning to respond to Harry's international success with violence was not entirely surprising, but it served as a reminder that the revolution he had started was far from complete, and that his enemies were becoming more desperate as their opportunities for restoring the old system diminished. But rather than feeling intimidated by the threat, Harry experienced something closer to grim satisfaction. If his opponents were resorting to terrorism and violence, it meant that their attempts to counter his reforms through legitimate political channels had failed completely. The war between the forces of corruption and those seeking justice was entering a new phase, one where the stakes were higher, but the moral clarity was even sharper than before. As Harry prepared to return to Britain to face whatever challenges awaited him there, he reflected on how completely his life and his understanding of his own purpose had evolved since that day in the Dursley attic, when he had first discovered the truth about his inheritance. He had begun as a victim, seeking personal justice, and had become an international leader working for systematic reform that would benefit millions of magical beings throughout the world. The scared child who had lived in a cupboard had grown into someone whose influence extended across continents, and whose vision for a more just, magical society was inspiring transformation in places he had never seen and among people he had never met. The revolution was no longer limited to magical Britain or even to the English-speaking magical world. It had become a global movement for justice and accountability that would continue long after Harry's own direct involvement had ended. But that continuation would depend on the choices he and his generation made in the critical years ahead, choices that would determine whether the principles of justice and protection that had inspired his original quest would become permanent features of magical society or temporary reforms that could be reversed when public attention moved on to other concerns. The future of magic itself was still at stake, and Harry Potter remained its most unlikely but most effective champion. The darkness came for Harry Potter on a winter night, when the ancient protections surrounding his properties should have been at their strongest. But desperation had made his enemies bold beyond reason and willing to pay prices in blood and magic that no rational person would consider acceptable. The attack, when it finally materialized, was everything that intelligence reports had suggested, and worse than even his most paranoid security advisors had predicted. Albus Dumbledore was dead, his reputation destroyed, his network of corruption exposed and dismantled, but the ideologies he had represented and the systems he had manipulated lived on in the hearts and minds of those who had benefited from the old order. These remnants of a discredited era had spent months in hiding, gathering resources, planning their revenge, and preparing for what they saw as their final opportunity to restore the world that Harry Potter had stolen from them. The assault began at 3 locations simultaneously, a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm Potter's guard and force Harry into a position where he would have to choose between protecting his allies and defending himself. Potter Manor in Scotland, the International Potter Foundation headquarters in London, and Grimmauld Place itself all came under siege by forces that combined dark wizard terrorism, corrupt ministry personnel, and international criminal elements that had been displaced by Harry's reforms. Harry woke to alarm systems that had never been designed to sound, ancient ward stones screaming warnings that their protective boundaries had been breached by enemies wielding magic that bordered on the forbidden. The very air around Potter Manor crackled with malevolent energy, as dozens of dark wizards, led by figures whose names had been whispered in fear for generations, began systematically dismantling the defensive enchantments that had protected the Potter family for centuries. But this was not simply a military assault designed to capture or kill a political enemy. This was a symbolic attack intended to send a message to every magical being who had supported Harry's reforms. The old ways could not be destroyed, the established order would reassert itself, and those who challenged traditional authority would face consequences that extended far beyond legal proceedings or political opposition. The leader of the assault was someone Harry had hoped never to encounter again. Bellatrix Lestrange, escaped from Azkaban through means that suggested corruption, reached far higher in the ministry than anyone had suspected. Her presence transformed what might have been a criminal attack into something approaching a holy war between fundamentally incompatible visions of what magical society should become. Lestrange had not simply escaped from wizard prison. She had used her freedom to organize every dark wizard, corrupt official, and supremacist ideologue who saw Harry's success as an existential threat to their worldview. Her followers included Death Eaters who had avoided prosecution, ministry employees who had been dismissed for corruption, and international dark wizards who had been displaced by reform movements inspired by Harry's example. The battle that erupted around Potter Manor was unlike anything the magical world had witnessed since the final confrontation with Voldemort himself. This was not a duel between individual wizards, but a full-scale military engagement between organized forces representing completely different philosophies of magical governance and social organization. Harry's defenders, led by Potter's Guard, but supplemented by allies from throughout the reformed magical community, fought with tactics and weapons that reflected the inclusive, multi-species approach that had become the hallmark of his movement. Goblin warriors wielding ancient battle magic fought alongside centaur archers whose arrows could pierce the strongest magical shields. House elves used their unique magical abilities to disrupt enemy communications and coordinate defensive strategies that took advantage of their intimate knowledge of the manor's layout. But it was the human members of Potter's Guard who provided the most shocking revelation for the attacking forces. These were not the soft, idealistic reformers that the dark wizards had expected to face, but hardened veterans who had been trained in combat techniques that combined traditional wizard magic with goblin warfare tactics and centaur strategic thinking. Remus Lupin, fighting with the enhanced strength and ferocity that his lycanthropy provided, demonstrated why werewolves had been feared by dark wizards for centuries. His combination of human intelligence and lupine instincts made him a nearly unstoppable opponent in close combat, while his deep knowledge of dark magic enabled him to counter spells and tactics that would have overwhelmed less experienced defenders. Draco Malfoy, proving that his rehabilitation was complete and his commitment to Harry's cause was genuine, fought against former allies and family associates with a determination that surprised everyone present. His intimate knowledge of dark wizard tactics and psychology, gained through his childhood immersion in that culture, made him invaluable in predicting and countering enemy strategies. But perhaps most effectively, the multi-species nature of Harry's forces created tactical advantages that the attacking dark wizards had never encountered before. Their spells and strategies were designed to combat human opponents using predictable wizard magic, but they proved inadequate against enemies who fought according to entirely different principles and possessed capabilities that existed outside traditional magical categories. As the battle raged through the grounds and corridors of Potter Manor, Harry found himself in the position he had been preparing for since the day he first decided to seek justice for the crimes committed against him. This was the final test of everything he had learned, everything he had built, and everything he believed about the proper use of power in service of justice. The year of intensive training he had undergone since his victory over Dumbledore had transformed him from a magically gifted child into something approaching a force of nature. His combat abilities now rivaled those of the most experienced battle wizards, but more importantly, his strategic thinking and tactical awareness had developed to the point where he could coordinate a complex multi-front defense while simultaneously engaging in personal combat with enemies whose power and experience would have overwhelmed him just months earlier. Harry's magic, unbound from the restrictions that had limited him for most of his life and enhanced by training techniques that few wizards had ever mastered, struck with devastating precision and overwhelming force. His spells were not simply more powerful than those of his opponents. They were more intelligent, more adaptable, and more efficiently directed toward achieving specific tactical objectives. But it was Harry's moral clarity that provided his greatest advantage in the confrontation. He was not fighting for personal gain, political power, or ideological supremacy, but for the protection of innocent people and the preservation of institutions that served justice rather than corruption. That moral certainty translated into magical force that his enemies, fighting for selfish and destructive purposes, could not match or counter. The turning point in the battle came when Bellatrix Lestrange herself confronted Harry in the manor's main hall, a chamber where portraits of his ancestors watched from their frames as the heir to their legacy faced the ultimate test of his worthiness to bear their name. "Little Lord Potter," Lestrange snarled with the kind of twisted maternal affection that characterized her relationship with violence. "You have been very naughty indeed. Time for your betters to teach you proper respect for your superiors. The magical duel that followed was a confrontation between representatives of fundamentally different approaches to power and its proper use. Lestrange fought with the unrestrained cruelty and sadistic enthusiasm that had made her one of Voldemort's most feared lieutenants. Her magic was powered by hatred, amplified by insanity, and directed toward causing as much suffering as possible, regardless of strategic necessity. Harry fought with controlled fury, channeled through techniques that maximized effectiveness while minimizing collateral damage. Every spell he cast was precisely calibrated to achieve specific objectives, and his tactical thinking remained clear and analytical, even under the pressure of combat against an opponent whose power and experience exceeded that of any enemy he had previously faced. The duel raged through multiple levels of the manor, leaving destruction in its wake that would require months to repair, but also demonstrating the gulf between Harry's disciplined approach to combat and Lestrange's chaotic destructiveness, where her spells tore apart ancient stonework and destroyed irreplaceable artifacts. Harry's magic struck with surgical precision that eliminated threats while preserving everything that could be saved. But more than magical technique, the confrontation revealed the fundamental difference in their understanding of what victory meant and what prices were acceptable to achieve it. Lestrange was willing to destroy everything around her, including her own followers, if doing so would enable her to eliminate Harry and restore the supremacist ideology he threatened. Harry was determined to protect not only himself, but everyone and everything that depended on his success, even if that made victory more difficult to achieve. As the battle reached its climax, Lestrange made the mistake that sealed her fate. In a desperate attempt to force Harry into a position where he would have to choose between his own survival and the safety of others, she began targeting the portraits of his ancestors, the house elves who had served his family for generations, and even the wounded members of Potter's Guard who were unable to defend themselves. Her assumption was that Harry's moral principles would make him vulnerable to exploitation, that his commitment to protecting others would force him to accept defeat rather than allow innocent people to suffer for his sake. But Harry had learned hard lessons about the relationship between mercy and justice during his confrontation with Dumbledore's corruption. Sometimes the most merciful action was to ensure that evil people could never again harm the innocent, even if that required taking actions that might seem harsh when viewed in isolation. Harry's response to Lestrange's escalation was swift, decisive, and final. Using advanced combat magic that combined techniques learned from goblin warriors with spells developed by his own ancestors, he created a magical construct that was both beautiful and terrible in its effectiveness. The spell that ended Bellatrix Lestrange's reign of terror was not the killing curse or any other forbidden magic, but something far more sophisticated and ultimately more devastating. Harry's construct turned Lestrange's own hatred and cruelty back against her with compound interest, creating a feedback loop that amplified her negative emotions until they consumed her from within. She fell not to external attack, but to the logical consequences of her own choices and beliefs, destroyed by the very forces that had given her power and purpose throughout her twisted life. The silence that followed Lestrange's death was profound and somehow cleansing. The most dangerous and destructive of Harry's enemies was gone, and with her fell the organized resistance to the reforms that had transformed magical society over the past year. But more than tactical victory, Lestrange's defeat represented the final repudiation of the ideologies and systems that had enabled corruption and abuse to flourish in magical society for generations. The supremacist beliefs that had justified exploitation of the vulnerable, the authoritarian structures that had concentrated power in the hands of the few, and the culture of impunity that had protected the powerful from the consequences of their actions, had all been challenged and found wanting. As Potter's Guard secured the battlefield and began cataloguing the evidence of the conspiracy that had organized the attack, Harry found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Less than 2 years earlier, he had been a powerless victim, with no hope of justice or independence. Tonight he had defended not only his own life, but the future of magical society itself against enemies who represented everything he had sworn to oppose. The attack had been intended to destroy Harry's movement and restore the old order through violence and intimidation. Instead, it had provided a final demonstration of the moral bankruptcy of that old order and the necessity of the reforms that Harry had championed. The dark wizards who survived the battle would face justice through legal systems that had been reformed according to principles of transparency and accountability. The corrupt officials who had enabled their escape and supported their attack would be exposed and prosecuted through processes that gave them full rights of defense, while ensuring that their crimes could not be hidden or minimized. Most importantly, the international magical community would see clear evidence of what Harry's enemies were willing to do to preserve systems that served their interests at the expense of everyone else's welfare. The battle at Potter Manor became a turning point, not just in Harry's personal journey, but in the broader transformation of magical society. The forces of corruption and supremacism had played their final card and lost decisively, leaving the field clear for continued progress toward the more just and equitable magical world that Harry's reforms had envisioned. But victory in battle was only the beginning of the challenges that lay ahead. The institutions Harry had built would need to prove their resilience and effectiveness over time, adapting to new challenges while maintaining their commitment to the principles that had inspired their creation. The educational programs, legal reforms, and political structures that had emerged from Harry's movement would be tested by future generations who had not experienced the corruption and abuse that had motivated their establishment. Would they maintain their vigilance against the gradual erosion of accountability? Would they resist the temptation to use their power for personal advantage rather than public service? As Harry stood in the ruins of his family's ancient home, surrounded by allies who had risked everything to defend the future they believed in, he understood that his role as a revolutionary leader was evolving into something different, but equally important. The work of transformation was far from complete, and it would require sustained effort and constant vigilance to ensure that the victories won through struggle and sacrifice would not be lost through complacency or compromise. The boy who had sought justice for crimes committed against him had become a young man responsible for protecting the institutions and principles that would serve justice for generations to come. The revolution was no longer a battle to be won, but a legacy to be preserved and extended, a living testament to the possibility that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be challenged and transformed when enough people committed themselves to the difficult work of creating something better. Harry Potter had proven that power could be used in service of justice rather than personal advancement, that institutions could be reformed rather than simply endured, and that the vulnerable could be protected rather than exploited by those who claimed authority over them. But most importantly, he had demonstrated that ordinary people, even those who began as victims rather than heroes, could find within themselves the courage and determination necessary to challenge injustice and create lasting change. The final battle had been won, but the work of building a better world was just beginning. And Harry Potter, no longer a frightened child, but not yet a fully mature adult, stood ready to lead that work with the wisdom earned through struggle and the moral clarity forged in the crucible of his extraordinary journey from victim to victor. The future remained unwritten, full of both promise and peril, but it would be shaped by principles of justice and accountability rather than corruption and abuse. That transformation, more than any individual victory, was Harry Potter's true legacy and his greatest gift to the magical world that had finally learned to be worthy of its most vulnerable members. The dawn that broke over magical Britain on the morning after the final battle revealed a world that had been fundamentally transformed by the courage of a boy who had refused to remain a victim. Harry Potter, standing at the window of his rebuilt study in Potter Manor, watched the sunrise paint the Scottish Highlands in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise a future bright, with possibilities that had been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. The destruction from the previous night's battle had been repaired with remarkable efficiency by house elves, goblins, and human allies working together in the kind of cooperative effort that would have been impossible under the old system. But more than physical reconstruction, the victory over Bellatrix Lestrange and her coalition of dark wizards had completed the ideological transformation that Harry's movement had been working toward since its beginning. The magical world was finally free from the shadow of corruption and supremacism that had poisoned its institutions for generations, and the work of building something better could proceed without the constant threat of violent opposition from those who profited from the old system. Harry's wedding to Daphne Greengrass took place 6 months after the battle, in a ceremony that served as both a personal celebration and a symbolic representation of the new magical society that their generation was creating. The event was held at Potter Manor, with guests representing every major magical community and species that had contributed to the reform movement's success. The ceremony itself reflected the inclusive principles that had guided Harry's political work. Traditional wizard marriage customs were combined with goblin bonding rituals, centaur blessing ceremonies, and even house elf service traditions that recognized the couple's commitment not only to each other, but to the broader magical community whose welfare they had dedicated their lives to protecting. Daphne, radiant in robes that had been crafted by artisans from multiple magical species and enchanted with protective spells from ancient Potter family grimoires, represented everything that Harry had come to value in a partner and ally. Her intelligence, moral clarity, and unwavering commitment to justice complemented his own abilities, while providing the emotional support and intellectual partnership that made their shared work both more effective and more personally fulfilling. The wedding guests included magical leaders from around the world who had travelled to Scotland to witness what many considered the most politically significant marriage in magical history. Ministers of magic, supreme mugwumps, and their equivalents from dozens of magical governments attended not simply to honour a popular young couple, but to demonstrate their continued support for the reform movement that Harry and Daphne represented. But perhaps more meaningfully, the ceremony also included hundreds of ordinary magical people whose lives had been improved by the institutional changes that Harry's movement had accomplished. Former victims of abuse and discrimination, young wizards whose educational opportunities had been expanded by alternative schooling programs, and magical creatures whose rights and dignity had been recognized for the first time in centuries, all gathered to celebrate the union of two people who had made their improved circumstances possible. The wedding reception featured an announcement that surprised even Harry's closest allies and advisors. He and Daphne had decided to establish the Potter Institute, a permanent educational and research institution that would ensure the continuation and expansion of the reform principles that had guided their work together. The institute would be located at Potter Manor, but would operate with campuses throughout the magical world, providing advanced education in magical theory, political science, ethical reasoning, and the practical skills necessary for effective leadership in reformed magical societies. Its graduates would be equipped not only with magical abilities that exceeded traditional training, but with the moral clarity and institutional knowledge necessary to preserve and extend the gains that had been made through struggle and sacrifice. But the Potter Institute represented more than just another educational program. It was designed to be a living laboratory for democratic governance, multi-species cooperation, and the kind of ethical leadership that had been so conspicuously absent from traditional magical institutions. Students would participate in actual governance of the Institute through elected councils and democratic decision-making processes that prepared them for leadership roles in the wider magical world. The faculty would include representatives from every major magical species and tradition, ensuring that graduates understood the full complexity and diversity of magical society, rather than just the narrow perspectives that had characterized traditional wizard education. Most importantly, the Institute would maintain the Potter Foundation's commitment to identifying and protecting vulnerable members of magical society, with special programs designed to help victims of abuse, discrimination, and systematic oppression recover their potential and contribute to the ongoing work of reform. As Harry and Daphne announced their plans for the Institute, they outlined a vision for magical society that went far beyond the reforms that had already been accomplished. They envisioned a future where magical ability would be understood as a gift that carried obligations to serve the common good rather than opportunities for personal advancement at others' expense. They described educational systems that would produce not just skilled magic users, but thoughtful citizens capable of participating effectively in democratic governance and multi-species cooperation. They articulated standards for political and institutional leadership that would make corruption and abuse of power not only illegal, but psychologically and socially impossible for people trained according to proper ethical principles. The response to their announcement was enthusiastic and immediate. Governments throughout the magical world committed funding and resources to support the Institute's work. Young wizards and witches from dozens of countries requested admission to programs that had not yet been formally established. Even former opponents of Harry's reforms expressed interest in educational approaches that might help them understand and adapt to the transformed magical world that their children would inherit. But the most significant response came from the next generation of magical children who had grown up during the period of transformation and who represented the first cohort to be educated entirely within reformed institutions. These young people, now reaching their majority and beginning to assume adult responsibilities in magical society, demonstrated capabilities and perspectives that exceeded anything that traditional magical education had ever produced. They thought critically about complex problems, cooperated effectively across species and cultural boundaries, and approached leadership opportunities with the kind of ethical seriousness that had been rare among their predecessors. Most importantly, they took for granted the principles of justice, accountability, and inclusive representation that Harry's generation had fought to establish. For them, the idea that powerful people might abuse their authority without facing consequences, or that magical society might systematically oppress vulnerable populations, was not just morally unacceptable, but practically incomprehensible. As Harry watched these young leaders begin to assume positions of responsibility throughout magical society, he realized that his work as a revolutionary was complete. The transformation he had initiated was now self-sustaining, carried forward by people who had internalized its principles so completely that they would continue advancing them even without his direct involvement. The Potter Institute's first graduating class, which included Harry's own eldest son, James, exemplified this successful transition. These young adults possessed magical abilities that had been enhanced by superior training methods, but more importantly, they understood their power as a tool for serving others rather than dominating them. James Potter, at 17, already demonstrated leadership qualities that combined his father's moral clarity with his mother's analytical intelligence and a natural charisma that drew followers from across the spectrum of magical society. His graduation speech, delivered to an audience that included magical leaders from around the world, articulated a vision for the future that built upon his parents' accomplishments while addressing challenges that their generation could not have anticipated. We inherit a magical world that our parents' generation transformed through courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to justice, James said, his voice carrying clearly through the great hall of the Potter Institute without magical amplification. But we also inherit the responsibility to continue that transformation, adapting their principles to new circumstances, while never losing sight of the fundamental truth that power exists to serve rather than to rule. The young man's speech outlined plans for expanding magical education to previously unreached populations, establishing new forms of international cooperation that transcended the limitations of traditional nation-state boundaries, and developing magical technologies that could address challenges like poverty, disease, and environmental degradation that affected both magical and non-magical communities. But perhaps most significantly, James and his generation understood their work as part of a continuing revolution rather than the administration of a completed transformation. They expected to face new forms of injustice and corruption that would require new solutions, and they were prepared to adapt their methods while maintaining their commitment to the principles that had guided their parents' success. 20 years after Harry Potter had first discovered evidence of theft in the Dursley attic, the magical world had been transformed beyond recognition. Institutions that had once served corruption and oppression had been reformed to promote justice and accountability. Educational systems that had once produced compliant followers had been redesigned to create thoughtful leaders. Political structures that had once concentrated power in the hands of a few had been democratized to enable meaningful participation by all members of magical society. But most importantly, magical society had developed the kind of ethical culture that made abuse of power not just illegal, but socially and psychologically impossible for people raised according to proper principles. The measures of success were visible everywhere Harry looked. Magical children throughout the world grew up in safety and security, with their potential nurtured rather than suppressed by the adults responsible for their care. Young wizards and witches received educational opportunities that prepared them for meaningful participation in democratic governance, rather than passive acceptance of authoritarian rule. Magical creatures enjoyed rights and recognition that enabled them to contribute their unique capabilities to the common good, rather than being marginalized and exploited by wizard supremacists. International cooperation flourished through institutions designed to serve justice rather than the narrow interests of powerful nations or individuals. Perhaps most satisfyingly for Harry personally, magical orphans and vulnerable children throughout the world now enjoyed the kind of protection and support that he had been denied during his own childhood. The Potter Foundation's programs had identified and assisted thousands of young people whose potential had been threatened by abuse, neglect, or systematic discrimination. These programs had not simply provided immediate relief for individual victims, but had created systemic changes that made such victimization far less likely in the future. Legal frameworks, educational initiatives, and cultural transformations had combined to create a magical society where the vulnerable were protected rather than exploited by those with power over them. As Harry reflected on these accomplishments during quiet moments at Potter Manor, surrounded by the family and allies who had made his success possible, he sometimes found it difficult to believe how completely his life had been transformed by that moment of discovery in the Dursley attic. The scared, abused child who had lived in a cupboard had become a husband, father, and leader, whose influence had reshaped magical society throughout the world. The powerless victim who had sought justice for crimes committed against him had created institutions and principles that would protect future generations from similar abuse. But Harry understood that his personal transformation was less important than the broader changes that his struggle had catalyzed. The magical world itself had been transformed from a collection of hierarchical societies that served the interests of the powerful into a community of democratic institutions that prioritized the welfare of all magical beings. The revolution that had begun with a 9-year-old boy's demand for justice had become a permanent feature of magical society, ensuring that future generations would inherit a world where power served justice rather than personal ambition. On quiet evenings, as Harry and Daphne walked through the gardens of Potter Manor with their children playing around them, they often discussed the lessons they had learned during their extraordinary journey from victims seeking justice to leaders responsible for protecting it. They had learned that meaningful change required not just moral clarity, but practical competence, not just individual courage, but institutional reform, not just temporary victories, but permanent transformations that could survive the passage of time and the changing of leadership. They had discovered that true power lay not in the ability to dominate others, but in the capacity to create systems that enabled everyone to reach their full potential while contributing to the common good. Most importantly, They had proven that even the most entrenched systems of corruption and oppression could be transformed by people who combined principled commitment with strategic thinking, and who were willing to pay the personal costs that meaningful reform required. The final chapter of their story was not an ending, but a beginning, the foundation upon which future generations would build as they faced new challenges and opportunities that Harry and Daphne could not fully anticipate. But they had provided those future generations with something invaluable, proof that transformation was possible, institutions that served justice rather than corruption, and principles that could guide ethical decision-making even in circumstances that their creators had never imagined. The magical world would continue to evolve and change, but it would do so according to principles of justice, accountability, and inclusive representation that had been established through struggle and sacrifice and proven through practical success. Harry Potter's revolution was complete, but its legacy would endure for as long as magical beings sought to create societies worthy of their highest aspirations and most cherished values. The boy who had lived in a cupboard had grown into a man who had helped create a world where no child would ever have to endure such treatment again. That transformation, more than any personal victory or political accomplishment, was the true measure of his success and the lasting gift he had given to the magical world that had finally learned to be worthy of its most vulnerable members. As Harry Potter watched his children play in the gardens of the ancestral home that had been restored through their family's commitment to justice, he knew that the future would be shaped by principles rather than personalities, by institutions rather than individuals, and by the kind of moral clarity that had transformed a victim's quest for justice into a revolution that would benefit magical beings throughout the world for generations to come. The story that had begun with theft and betrayal had ended with justice and transformation, proving that even in a world of magic, the most powerful force was still the courage of ordinary people who refused to accept injustice as inevitable, and who were willing to pay whatever price was necessary to create something better. That courage, more than any spell or magical artifact, was Harry Potter's true legacy, and the foundation upon which the future of magical society would continue to be built. Griphook led Harry through the marble corridors of Gringotts with a purposeful stride that spoke of decades navigating the bank's labyrinthine passages. The goblins' sharp eyes missed nothing as they walked, taking note of other goblins who paused in their work to stare at the small human child walking beside their colleague. Word travelled fast in Gringotts, and the appearance of Harry Potter after 9 years of absence was already causing ripples throughout the ancient institution. The office Griphook brought him to was unlike anything Harry had ever seen. The walls were lined with ledgers bound in what appeared to be dragon hide, and the desk was carved from a single piece of what looked like black marble, shot through with veins of silver and gold. Behind the desk sat the most intimidating creature Harry had ever encountered. If Griphook had seemed tall for a goblin, this one was positively towering. His skin had the weathered appearance of ancient parchment, and his dark eyes held the accumulated wisdom and suspicion of centuries. When he smiled, which he did upon seeing Harry, his teeth gleamed like polished daggers. "Mr. Potter," the ancient goblin said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I am Senior Account Manager Bloodbane, and I have been managing your family's affairs for longer than most wizards have been alive. We have much to discuss." Harry settled into the chair across from Bloodbane's desk, which adjusted itself to accommodate his small frame. The silver key grew warm in his pocket, and he could feel a subtle magic in the air that seemed to evaluate him, testing his intentions and his right to be there. "Before we begin," Bloodbane continued, "I must perform the inheritance test. This will confirm your identity beyond any doubt and reveal the full extent of your rightful holdings. Many young wizards are surprised by what they discover." The goblin produced a ceremonial dagger that gleamed with its own inner light, and a piece of parchment that seemed to shimmer with possibility. At Harry's nervous look, Bloodbane's expression softened slightly. A single drop of blood. Nothing more. The magic will do the rest. Harry extended his hand, and Bloodbane made the smallest possible cut on his fingertip. The drop of blood that fell onto the parchment immediately began to spread in intricate patterns, forming words and symbols that glowed briefly before settling into permanent visibility. What Harry saw on that parchment changed everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the magical world. The document revealed that Harry James Potter was not simply the heir to the Potter family fortune. He was the heir to no fewer than 7 ancient magical bloodlines, each carrying its own vaults, properties, and treaty obligations. Through his father, he inherited the Potter, Peveril, and Gryffindor lines. Through his mother, he carried the blood of Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and through ancient marriage contracts, connections to the Slytherin and Black family lines. Each bloodline came with its own vault at Gringotts, its own properties scattered across magical Britain and beyond, and its own ancient contracts and obligations. The Potter Vault alone contained over 2 million galleons, but it was merely the smallest of his holdings. The Peveril Vault, sealed for centuries, held artifacts and treasures that made the Potter wealth look modest by comparison. But it was the final revelation that made Harry's hands tremble as he read. According to the inheritance test, he was not just wealthy beyond imagination. He was the rightful owner of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry itself, inherited through his connection to all 4 founders. Bloodbane watched Harry's face carefully as the implications sank in. The goblin's expression had shifted to something approaching reverence, mixed with anticipation. "Now you understand, Mr. Potter, why your case is of such interest to the Goblin nation. You are not simply another wealthy wizard child. You are the heir to the most powerful magical bloodlines in Britain, and according to our records, someone has been systematically looting your inheritance for nearly a decade." The Goblin spread out a collection of documents that made Harry's stomach churn. Bank statements showing withdrawals totaling over 500,000 galleons, all authorized by Albus Dumbledore as Harry's magical guardian. Property deeds signed over to the Ministry of Magic without Harry's knowledge or consent. Investment accounts liquidated and their contents transferred to something called the Order of Phoenix. Most damning of all was a contract bearing Dumbledore's signature, giving him complete financial control over Harry's inheritance until the boy reached his majority. The contract was obviously forged, bearing none of the magical seals that would make it legally binding, and several clauses directly contradicted the explicit instructions left by James and Lily Potter. "This is theft, Mr. Potter," Bloodbane said with grim satisfaction. "Under Goblin law, which supersedes wizard law in all matters pertaining to Gringotts accounts, Albus Dumbledore has committed multiple felonies: the unauthorized access to your vaults, the forged guardianship documents, the liquidation of assets without proper authority. All of these carry severe penalties." Harry stared at the evidence before him, his young mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had been done to him. He had been raised in poverty and abuse, while his rightful inheritance could have provided him with every comfort imaginable. More than that, the money stolen from him had been used to fund whatever this Order of Phoenix was, meaning his own resources had been turned against his interests. But there was something else, something that made the betrayal even worse. According to the documents, regular payments had been made to Vernon and Petunia Dursley, ostensibly for Harry's care and upkeep. The amounts were staggering, enough to keep a family in luxury, yet Harry had been fed scraps, dressed in rags and locked in a cupboard. The Dursleys had been paid handsomely to abuse him, and they had taken the money gladly, while treating him like a burden they resented having to bear. "What can be done about this?" Harry asked, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. Bloodbane smiled, and the expression was genuinely terrifying. Under Goblin law, theft from a Gringotts account is considered an act of war against the Goblin nation. We have treaties with the wizarding world that give us considerable legal authority in such matters. We can demand full restitution including penalties and interest. We can freeze all of Dumbledore's assets until the matter is resolved, and we can ensure that he faces justice in both Goblin and Wizard courts." The ancient Goblin leaned forward, his dark eyes glittering with anticipation. "But more than that, Mr. Potter, we can ensure that you are properly protected while these legal proceedings take place. Whoever did this to you will not be pleased when they discover their crimes have been exposed. You will need allies, and the Goblin nation has ancient obligations to your bloodlines that we take very seriously." Harry felt something shift inside him, a sense of power and possibility that he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he had allies who were not only willing to help him, but who had their own reasons for wanting justice done. "I want to hire you," Harry said firmly. "All of you. I want every galleon returned, every document examined, and everyone who participated in this theft held accountable." Bloodbane's smile grew wider. "It would be our honor, Lord Potter. The Goblin nation has been waiting for an opportunity to remind the wizarding world that our laws have teeth." The Goblin produced an ornate contract written in multiple languages, including several that Harry couldn't identify. As Bloodbane explained the terms, Harry realized he was not simply hiring a legal representative. He was entering into an alliance with an entire nation, one with its own military, its own magical traditions, and its own ancient grudges against wizard corruption. The contract established Harry as a friend of the Goblin nation, a title that carried both privileges and responsibilities. The Goblins would provide him with legal representation, financial management, and personal protection. In return, Harry would honor the ancient treaties his ancestors had signed and support Goblin interests in the wizarding world. When Harry signed the contract, he felt a subtle shift in the magic around him. The silver key in his pocket grew warm, and he sensed that he was now under the protection of forces far older and more powerful than anything he had previously understood. But Bloodbane was not finished. "There is another matter we must address, Lord Potter. Your magical education and development have been deliberately stunted, but we have detected signs that your natural abilities are far beyond what anyone has suspected." The Goblin gestured, and another figure entered the office. This Goblin was younger than Bloodbane, but carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a warrior. His arms bore ritual scars that spoke of battles fought and won, and the weapons at his side were clearly not merely ceremonial. "This is Ironhide," Bloodbane explained. "He will be responsible for your personal protection, and, if you desire it, your magical training. The Goblin nation has its own martial magical traditions, quite different from what you would learn at Hogwarts." Ironhide studied Harry with calculating eyes, then nodded slowly. "The bloodlines are strong in this one," he said, in a voice like grinding stone. With proper training, he could surpass most adult wizards within a year. Harry felt a thrill of possibility. He had always known he was different, had always felt magic crackling beneath his skin when he was emotional or desperate. To learn that this power could be trained, could be developed into something formidable, was intoxicating. But first, there were practical matters to address. Harry was still a 9-year-old boy with nowhere to live, and no legal guardian who wasn't either abusive or criminal. "We have prepared accommodations for you," Bloodbane said, anticipating Harry's concerns. "The Goblin nation maintains several properties in the wizarding world for our business interests. You will be quite comfortable, and more importantly, you will be completely safe from any attempts at magical interference." The Goblin produced a small stone that glowed with soft blue light. "This is a ward stone, keyed to your magical signature. As long as you carry it, no wizard magic can track you, influence you, or harm you without your explicit permission. Consider it insurance against any further manipulation." Harry pocketed the ward stone, feeling immediately lighter as several magical influences he hadn't even known were there suddenly lifted from his mind. The sensation was like taking a deep breath after being underwater, and he realized that his thoughts felt clearer and sharper than they had in years. "Now then," Bloodbane continued, "we should discuss the next steps in your legal case. The evidence against Dumbledore is overwhelming, but presenting it properly will require careful planning. The wizarding world has great reverence for the man, and they will not accept accusations against him lightly." Harry listened as the goblins outlined their strategy. They would begin by formally requesting an accounting of all transactions from Harry's vaults, a perfectly legitimate action for the account holder to take. When Dumbledore failed to provide proper documentation, they would escalate to formal theft charges. The beauty of the approach was that it would force Dumbledore to either admit his crimes or provide forged documents, both of which would destroy his reputation. But the legal proceedings were only part of what the goblins had in mind. They also intended to launch a comprehensive audit of every wizarding institution that had received funds from Harry's inheritance. If the Order of Phoenix had been operating on stolen money, that made every member an accessory to the crime. The investigation would also examine the circumstances of Harry's placement with the Dursleys. If Dumbledore had arranged for them to be paid for Harry's care while knowing they would abuse him, that represented a separate set of criminal charges. As the meeting continued, Harry felt a growing sense of amazement at the thoroughness of goblin law and the extent of their reach into wizarding affairs. These were not the simple bankers he had imagined, but a sophisticated civilization with their own intelligence networks, legal traditions, and military capabilities. When the formal business was concluded, Ironhide escorted Harry to his new accommodations. The Goblin safe house was located beneath Diagon Alley, accessed through passages that existed in the spaces between the official shops above. The rooms were comfortable but clearly defensible, with magical wards that would make them impregnable to any wizard assault. That evening, as Harry sat in his first real bedroom since leaving his parents', he reflected on how completely his life had changed in a single day. This morning he had been Harry Potter, unwanted orphan and victim. Tonight he was Lord Potter, heir to ancient bloodlines and allied with forces that could challenge the most powerful wizards in Britain. But more than the wealth and status, what filled Harry with satisfaction was the knowledge that justice would finally be done. The people who had betrayed him, stolen from him, and condemned him to years of abuse would face the consequences of their actions. As he drifted off to sleep in his new bed, surrounded by goblin guards who had sworn to protect him with their lives, Harry Potter dreamed of the moment when he would confront Albus Dumbledore and demand an accounting for every stolen galleon, every forged document, and every day of unnecessary suffering. The war for justice had begun, and Harry finally had the allies and resources to win it. But in the deepest vaults of Gringotts, ancient magics were stirring in response to Harry's presence. The inheritance test had revealed more than just his bloodline connections. It had awakened sleeping enchantments that had waited centuries for the right heir to claim them. Powers that Dumbledore had never suspected, abilities that the Goblin nation had long hoped to see return to the world, were beginning to manifest in the small boy who had walked into their bank seeking justice. The magical world was about to discover that they had underestimated Harry Potter in ways that would reshape everything they thought they knew about power, justice, and the price of betrayal. And in a small office, deep beneath London, Bloodbane smiled as he prepared the first legal documents that would bring down the most respected wizard in Britain. The Goblin nation had not forgotten the insults and dismissals they had endured from wizard society, and now they had the perfect weapon to remind everyone that Goblin justice was both thorough and inevitable. The game had begun, and this time the Goblins intended to win decisively. The next morning brought revelations that would have shattered a lesser mind, but Harry Potter was discovering that he was made of sterner stuff than anyone had suspected. Bloodbane arrived at the Goblin safe house, carrying a collection of documents that represented 3 days of intensive investigation into every aspect of Harry's stolen inheritance and deliberately suppressed magical development. The evidence was damning beyond anything Harry had imagined possible. As they settled into the secure conference room deep beneath Diagon Alley, Bloodbane spread the documents across the table with the methodical precision of someone building an unassailable legal case. Each piece of parchment represented another layer of betrayal, another crime committed against a child who had been unable to defend himself. The first document was a magical analysis of Harry himself, performed by goblin healers while he slept. The results were staggering. Harry's magical core, the source of a wizard's power, had been artificially suppressed by no fewer than 7 different binding spells, all bearing Dumbledore's magical signature. These bindings, Bloodbane explained with barely controlled fury, were designed to limit your magical development to roughly 20% of your natural capacity. They were placed on you as an infant and reinforced annually without your knowledge or consent. Harry stared at the medical report, struggling to comprehend what he was reading. The goblin healers estimated that his true magical potential was approximately 15 times stronger than what he had been allowed to access. In practical terms, this meant that even as a 9-year-old child, his unbound power would rival that of most adult wizards. But the magical suppression was only the beginning of what had been done to him. The second set of documents revealed the existence of monitoring charms that had tracked Harry's every movement and emotion since his placement with the Dursleys. Dumbledore had known exactly how badly he was being treated, had detailed reports of every act of abuse and neglect, yet had done nothing to improve Harry's situation. More disturbing still were the memory modification attempts. The documents showed evidence of repeated attempts to alter Harry's memories, though most had failed due to his natural magical resistance. The attempts had been clumsy and frequent, suggesting that Dumbledore was trying to remove or alter memories of accidental magic incidents that might have revealed Harry's true power. The third revelation was perhaps the most infuriating. Among Dumbledore's personal papers, obtained through goblin intelligence networks that Harry was learning had impressive reach, were detailed psychological profiles of Harry. These documents revealed that Dumbledore had deliberately orchestrated Harry's abusive upbringing as part of a long-term manipulation strategy. According to Dumbledore's own notes, a child raised in deprivation and abuse would be more grateful for rescue, more willing to sacrifice himself for others, and less likely to question authority. The abuse had been intentional, designed to create a weapon that would willingly die when the time came. Harry felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest as he absorbed this information. He had not simply been neglected or forgotten. He had been deliberately tortured as part of a calculated plan to turn him into a willing martyr. But the goblins had saved their most significant discovery for last. Hidden in the deepest vaults of Gringotts, in sections that even most goblins were not permitted to access, they had found the original Potter family grimoire. This ancient book, protected by blood wards that had recognized Harry's magical signature, contained the accumulated magical knowledge of his family, stretching back over 1,000 years. The grimoire revealed that the Potter family were not simply wealthy purebloods, as most of the wizarding world believed. They were descendants of Ignotus Peverell, the original owner of the invisibility cloak, and one of the 3 brothers who had first mastered death itself. The Potter bloodline carried within it magical abilities that most wizards considered purely theoretical. Harry was the heir to powers that included natural resistance to the killing curse, the ability to speak with and command the dead, and most significantly, mastery over the 3 deathly hallows that would make him the master of death itself. The grimoire also contained detailed instructions for removing magical bindings, accessing blocked magical cores, and developing the kind of combat magic that had not been seen in the wizarding world for centuries. The Potters had been warrior scholars, combining intellectual brilliance with devastating magical ability. As Bloodbane explained the contents of the grimoire, Harry felt his own magic responding to the knowledge. The ward stone in his pocket grew warm, and the air around him began to shimmer with barely contained power. For the first time in his life, Harry was beginning to understand what he truly was and what he was capable of becoming. But knowledge alone would not be enough. The magical bindings that had suppressed his power for nearly a decade would need to be removed carefully, lest the sudden release of so much magical energy tear him apart from within. "This is why we have summoned our most skilled battle mages," Bloodbane explained, gesturing toward the door. "The removal process will be dangerous, but the alternative is to remain forever limited to a fraction of your true abilities." The goblin who entered the room was unlike any Harry had seen before. Where other goblins were tall and sharp-featured, this one was compact and powerfully built, with ritual scars covering his arms and a presence that made the air itself seem heavier. His eyes glowed with an inner fire that spoke of magic used in ways that most wizards never imagined. "I am Forge Master Ironbound," the goblin announced in a voice like distant thunder. "I have been removing illegal magical bindings for over 2 centuries, and I have never seen restrictions as comprehensive as those placed on this child." The removal process would take place in a specially prepared chamber, deep in the goblin warrens, protected by wards that could contain the magical energies that would be released. Harry would need to remain conscious throughout the procedure, actively participating in the unraveling of the spells that had defined his entire life. As they descended further into the depths of Gringotts than Harry had known was possible, he began to understand that the Goblin Nation was far more than a collection of bankers and craftsmen. These were a warrior people with their own ancient magics, their own traditions of power, and their own reasons for wanting to see the wizarding world's assumptions about strength and authority challenged. The chamber they brought him to was circular, carved from solid stone, and inscribed with runes that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. At the center lay an altar-like table, surrounded by floating crystals that pulsed with captured moonlight. "Before we begin," Ironbound explained, "you must understand what you are choosing. Once these bindings are removed, there will be no hiding your true nature. Every wizard with the ability to sense magical power will know immediately that you are far more dangerous than you appear." Harry considered this warning carefully. Removing the bindings would make him a target, would force him to live his life, knowing that others would fear and potentially try to destroy him. But the alternative was to remain forever diminished, forever dependent on others for protection he should be able to provide for himself. The choice was obvious. "Do it," Harry said firmly. "I'm tired of being weak." The removal process was unlike anything Harry could have imagined. As Ironbound began the complex ritual that would unravel Dumbledore's binding spells, Harry felt power flowing back into him, like water into a drought-stricken riverbed. His magical core, compressed and constrained for so long, began to expand to its natural size. The sensation was overwhelming. Magic coursed through his veins like liquid fire, and his awareness expanded to encompass the entire chamber. He could sense the magical signatures of every goblin present, could feel the ancient wards protecting the room, could even detect the magical creatures moving through the tunnels far above. But with the return of his power came memories that the binding spells had suppressed. Harry suddenly remembered things he had done as a very young child, feats of accidental magic that had been far beyond what should have been possible for someone his age. He remembered making a bully's hair turn purple for a week, making his aunt's favorite vase explode when she was particularly cruel, and once, in a moment of desperate terror, making himself completely invisible to avoid one of Vernon's violent rages. The memories kept coming as more bindings were removed. He remembered dreams that were not dreams at all, but visions of events happening elsewhere. He remembered understanding languages he had never been taught, knowing things about magic that no one had ever explained to him. Most disturbing of all, he remembered the night his parents died, with a clarity that made his previous memories seem like shadows. He remembered his mother's voice, not just her final words, but the powerful magic she had woven into her sacrifice. He remembered his father's desperate last stand, and the sound of Voldemort's laughter as he cast the killing curse. And he remembered something else, something that chilled him to the bone. He remembered Voldemort's surprise when the killing curse rebounded, and the Dark Wizard's final words before his body was destroyed. Voldemort had not simply been trying to kill Harry, he had been trying to steal something from him, something that Harry possessed by right of birth. The memory was incomplete, fragmented by trauma and time, but one phrase echoed clearly in Harry's mind: the power the Dark Lord knows not. Voldemort had been seeking something specific, and his failure to obtain it had led directly to his downfall. As the final binding spell unraveled, Harry felt a transformation that was both physical and spiritual. His magical core, no longer constrained, settled into a configuration that would have been impossible under the artificial limitations. Power flowed through him in patterns that felt both alien and utterly natural, as if he was finally becoming who he was always meant to be. When Ironbound stepped back, indicating that the procedure was complete, Harry opened his eyes to find that the world had changed. Colors were more vivid, sounds were clearer, and he could sense magical energy flowing through everything around him, like an underlying current that connected all living things. But most remarkable of all was what he saw when he looked at his own hands. Faint silver lines traced patterns across his palms, marking him as someone who had survived the removal of major magical bindings. The marks would fade in time, but for now they served as visible proof of what had been done to him and what he had overcome. "How do you feel, Lord Potter?" Bloodbane asked, his voice carrying a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine concern. Harry considered the question carefully. He felt more himself than he ever had before, as if he had been living his entire life wearing weights that had suddenly been removed. But he also felt dangerous in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I feel like I could tear down mountains," Harry admitted, "and like I want to find everyone who did this to me and make them pay." The goblins exchanged satisfied looks. The binding removal had been successful, but more than that, it had revealed the kind of controlled fury that made for effective warriors. Harry Potter was no longer a victim to be protected. He was becoming a force to be reckoned with. But his magical education was far from complete. The grimoire contained knowledge that would take years to fully master, and his combat training had not yet begun. Most importantly, he still needed to learn how to control his newly unbound power before it attracted the wrong kind of attention. Ironbound produced a collection of books that looked nothing like the textbooks used at Hogwarts. These were bound in scales and metal, inscribed with runes that seemed to whisper secrets when touched, and filled with magical techniques that the wizarding world had either forgotten or deliberately suppressed. "Your formal education begins now," the Forge Master explained. "The magic you will learn here is not the flashy spell work taught to children. This is battle magic, the kind used by warriors who fight for their lives and the lives of those they protect." Over the following days, Harry threw himself into his studies with an intensity that surprised even the goblins. He absorbed information about magical theory, combat techniques, and political strategy, with the desperate hunger of someone who had been starved of knowledge his entire life. The goblin approach to magic was fundamentally different from wizard methodology. Where wizards relied on wands as focuses for their power, goblins taught that truly powerful magic came from within and could be channeled through will alone. Where wizards learned standardized spells with predictable effects, goblins emphasized adaptation and innovation. Most importantly, where wizard education focused on following rules and respecting authority, goblin training emphasized independent thinking and personal responsibility. A goblin warrior was expected to question orders, think tactically, and take initiative when circumstances demanded it. The combination of his newly unbound magical power and this fundamentally different approach to magical education had a transformative effect on Harry. Within days, he was performing feats that should have required years of training. He could cast spells without speaking, could shape magical energy with nothing but focused thought, and could sense magical deceptions from considerable distances. But perhaps most significantly, he was learning to think like someone with real power rather than someone who depended on others for protection. Every lesson, every exercise, every theoretical discussion reinforced the same essential truth. He was responsible for his own safety and success. As his training progressed, Harry began to understand why Dumbledore had been so determined to keep him weak and dependent. A Harry Potter with access to his full magical abilities, trained in combat magic, and taught to think independently would be impossible to control or manipulate. Such a person might ask uncomfortable questions about why he had been placed with abusive relatives, might demand explanations for the theft of his inheritance, and might refuse to play the role of willing sacrifice in whatever grand plan Dumbledore had developed. In other words, such a person would be exactly what Harry was becoming. The realization filled him with grim satisfaction. Every day of training, every new spell mastered, every tactical principle learned was another step away from the helpless victim Dumbledore had tried to create and toward the independent force that would hold him accountable for his crimes. But Harry was also learning patience. The Goblin legal case against Dumbledore was proceeding methodically, gathering evidence and building an unassailable foundation for prosecution. Rushing into confrontation before the trap was fully set would only give Dumbledore opportunities to escape justice or retaliate against Harry. So Harry trained and studied and planned and felt his power growing stronger each day. The scared little boy who had lived in a cupboard was becoming someone entirely different, someone who could stand as an equal among the most powerful wizards in the world. And in the deepest vaults of his mind, Harry began to consider what he would do with that power once Dumbledore had been brought to justice. The wizarding world was full of corruption and abuse, full of people who suffered because those with power chose to ignore their pain. Perhaps it was time for someone to change that. Perhaps it was time for someone to remind the magical world that power came with responsibilities, and that failing to meet those responsibilities had consequences. Harry Potter was no longer content to simply seek justice for the wrongs done to him. He was beginning to envision a world where such wrongs could never happen again, where those who would abuse and manipulate others would face swift and certain retribution. The revolution was coming, and it would begin with a boy who had refused to remain a victim. The morning that would reshape the wizarding world forever began with a carefully orchestrated legal assault that caught the Ministry of Magic completely unprepared. Bloodbane had spent 2 weeks methodically building an unassailable case, and now he was ready to deploy it with the precision of a master strategist who had been planning this campaign for decades. The formal theft charges were delivered simultaneously to 3 locations: the office of Minister Cornelius Fudge, the desk of Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot Albus Dumbledore, and the front desk of the Daily Prophet. Each document was sealed with the official mark of the Goblin Nation and carried the weight of centuries-old treaties that no wizard government could simply ignore. Harry watched from the secure observation chamber deep within Gringotts as the magical world's power structure received its first real shock in generations. Through scrying mirrors that the goblins had positioned throughout magical London, he could see the chaos his case was causing in real time. At the ministry, Minister Fudge was pacing his office like a caged animal, while his senior advisors scrambled to understand the legal implications of what they were facing. The charges were not simply criminal accusations. They represented a formal challenge to wizard authority by a sovereign magical nation, backed by treaties that predated the ministry itself. The documents Bloodbane had prepared were masterpieces of legal precision. Every accusation was supported by irrefutable evidence. Every claim was backed by multiple sources, and every legal precedent cited was unassailable. Most importantly, the charges were filed under Goblin law, which meant that wizard courts had no authority to dismiss them without risking a complete breakdown of magical Britain's financial system. The core accusations were devastating in their simplicity. Albus Dumbledore stood formally charged with grand theft, fraud, forgery, illegal magical binding of a minor, conspiracy to commit child abuse, and violation of ancient magical contracts. Each charge carried penalties that would strip him of wealth, magical privileges, and freedom. But the charges were only the beginning of what Bloodbane had planned. The second phase of the Goblin strategy involved a comprehensive audit of every wizarding institution that had received funds from Harry's stolen inheritance. The Order of Phoenix, several ministry departments, and even portions of Hogwarts' operating budget were now subject to investigation by Goblin auditors with full legal authority to examine financial records. The implications were staggering. If the audit revealed that taxpayer funds or tuition payments had been supplemented by stolen money, it would implicate dozens of respected wizarding figures in criminal activity. The scandal would rock the magical world's government and educational system to their foundations. Harry felt a fierce satisfaction as he watched the wizard establishment scramble to respond to forces they had never bothered to understand or respect. For too long, the Goblin nation had been dismissed as mere bankers, useful for storing wizard wealth, but unworthy of serious political consideration. Now they were learning that goblins had long memories, sharp legal minds, and the power to bring down even the most revered wizard leaders when those leaders violated goblin law. The third element of Bloodbane's strategy was perhaps the most brilliant. Rather than simply seeking financial restitution, the charges included demands for Harry's immediate recognition as an emancipated minor with full legal rights. This would strip Dumbledore of any remaining authority over Harry's life while establishing him as a legal adult, despite his age. The request was unprecedented, but perfectly legal under Goblin law, which recognized that magical maturity and chronological age were not necessarily linked. Harry's demonstrated magical abilities, combined with the evidence of systematic abuse by his previous guardians, created compelling grounds for emancipation. If successful, the emancipation would make Harry one of the most powerful individuals in magical Britain overnight. As the legal owner of multiple ancient bloodline vaults, numerous properties, and significant business interests, he would possess wealth and influence that rivaled the old pureblood families. More importantly, emancipation would give him the legal standing to pursue his own agenda for reforming the wizarding world without interference from adults who claimed to know what was best for him. As Harry watched the initial responses to the legal filing, he began to understand the full scope of what the goblins had orchestrated on his behalf. This was not simply a criminal case seeking justice for past wrongs. It was a comprehensive assault on the wizard power structure designed to establish Harry as an independent force capable of challenging the established order. The first sign that the wizard establishment understood the threat came when Dumbledore himself appeared at the ministry within hours of receiving the charges. Through the scrying mirrors, Harry could see the aged wizard in heated discussion with Minister Fudge and several senior officials. Dumbledore's usual grandfatherly demeanor had been replaced by something far more calculating and dangerous. The mask of benevolent leadership had slipped, revealing the political manipulator beneath. His gestures were sharp, his expression grim, and his words carried the kind of authority that reminded everyone present why he was considered the most powerful wizard of his generation. But for the first time in his long career, Dumbledore was facing opponents who were not intimidated by his reputation or impressed by his political connections. The Goblin nation had been dealing with powerful wizards for millennia, and they had learned that even the most formidable magic users could be brought down by patient legal maneuvering and irrefutable evidence. The Daily Prophet's coverage of the story created the public spectacle that Bloodbane had been counting on. The headline alone was enough to shake wizard society to its core. Lord Potter accuses Dumbledore of massive theft. The article detailed the charges in language that even casual readers could understand, and the implications were clear to anyone with basic knowledge of wizarding law. Within hours, emergency sessions were being called in the Wizengamot. Special editions of magical newspapers were flying off the stands, and owls were carrying urgent messages throughout the wizarding world. The story was too big to suppress and too well documented to dismiss, but the real shock came when Harry made his first public appearance since infancy. The goblins had arranged for him to attend a formal hearing at the ministry, ostensibly to provide testimony in support of the theft charges. In reality, it was a carefully orchestrated debut designed to introduce the wizarding world to the person Harry had become under Goblin tutelage. The boy who entered the ministry's main courtroom bore little resemblance to the scrawny, abused child who had lived in a cupboard just weeks earlier. Proper nutrition, magical healing, and the removal of his binding spells had allowed Harry's natural physical development to proceed normally for the first time in his life. He carried himself with the confident bearing of someone who had trained with goblin warriors, and his magical aura was strong enough to be felt by everyone present. Most remarkably, his eyes held the kind of focused intelligence that marked him as someone far older and more experienced than his chronological age would suggest. Harry was dressed in formal robes that had been crafted by goblin tailors using techniques that produced garments, both elegant and protective. The fabric was woven with defensive enchantments that would turn aside most harmful spells, and the cut emphasized his growing physical maturity while remaining appropriate for someone his age. But it was the magical artifacts he wore that truly announced his changed status to anyone capable of recognizing their significance. The Potter family ring gleamed on his finger, identifying him as the rightful head of his ancient bloodline. Around his neck hung an amulet that marked him as a friend of the Goblin Nation, a title that carried both privilege and protection. Most significantly, he carried a staff rather than a wand, marking him as someone who had mastered the kind of advanced magical techniques that most wizards never attempted. The staff was carved from heartwood, taken from the Whomping Willow at Hogwarts, inlaid with silver from the goblin mines, and topped with a crystal that pulsed with captured starlight. The reaction to Harry's appearance was everything Bloodbane had hoped for, and more. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as people struggled to reconcile the powerful young man before them with their expectations of the boy who lived. Several ministry officials actually stepped back as Harry passed, instinctively recognizing the magical strength he now commanded. But it was Dumbledore's reaction that provided the most satisfaction. For just a moment, the old wizard's carefully maintained composure cracked completely. His eyes widened in shock as he took in the evidence of Harry's transformation, and his face went pale as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. This was not the malleable child Dumbledore had expected to control for several more years. This was someone who had clearly been trained by people who understood power and had no intention of allowing that power to be suppressed or misused. When Harry took his place at the witness stand, the entire courtroom fell silent. His voice, when he began to speak, carried clearly to every corner of the room without magical amplification. More importantly, it carried the kind of quiet authority that made people listen carefully to every word. "Members of the Wizengamot," Harry began, addressing the assembly with the formal courtesy that goblin tutors had drilled into him. "I appear before you today, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as the rightful heir to ancient magical bloodlines demanding justice for crimes committed against my person and my inheritance." The testimony that followed was devastating in its precision and restraint. Harry did not rant or rage about the injustices he had suffered. Instead, he methodically presented evidence, cited legal precedents, and demonstrated a command of magical law that many adult wizards lacked. He described the conditions of his upbringing with clinical detachment, focusing on the financial aspects that fell under Wizengamot jurisdiction, rather than the emotional damage that would have been harder to quantify legally. He explained how the discovery of his parents' documents had led him to seek goblin assistance, and he detailed the evidence of systematic theft that the goblin investigation had uncovered. Most damaging of all, Harry presented his own medical records, showing the magical binding spells that had suppressed his natural abilities. The evidence was unambiguous. Someone had deliberately crippled his magical development while stealing the inheritance that should have provided him with proper care and education. Throughout his testimony, Harry demonstrated his recovered magical abilities with casual displays of power that left the assembled wizards speechless. He levitated objects without gesturing, lit candles with focused thought, and even demonstrated his ability to detect magical deceptions by identifying several concealment charms that ministry officials had thought were undetectable. The message was clear. Harry Potter was no longer a child to be protected or controlled. He was a force to be reckoned with, someone whose magical abilities and legal standing made him the equal of any adult in the wizarding world. But perhaps most significantly, Harry's testimony revealed his deep understanding of the political implications of his case. This was not simply about recovering stolen money or punishing those who had wronged him. It was about establishing new standards of accountability for those who held power over others. When Dumbledore finally rose to respond to the charges, he faced a hostile audience and overwhelming evidence of his guilt. His usual strategy of appealing to emotion and invoking his reputation for fighting dark wizards fell flat in the face of documented financial crimes and medical evidence of illegal magical manipulation. The old wizard attempted to justify his actions by claiming they had been necessary for Harry's protection and the greater good of the wizarding world. He argued that Harry's true magical potential would have made him a target for dark wizards, and that the financial arrangements had been intended to ensure his safety rather than to enrich anyone personally. But Dumbledore's explanations only made his crimes appear worse. The assembled Wizengamot members were horrified to learn that he had deliberately arranged for Harry to be abused and magically crippled as part of a calculated strategy. The revelation that he had stolen hundreds of thousands of galleons to fund his own political organization while leaving Harry in poverty was met with audible gasps of outrage. Most damning of all was Dumbledore's admission that he had planned for Harry to eventually sacrifice himself in a confrontation with Voldemort. The casual way he discussed the deliberate creation of a child soldier, trained from birth to die for the cause, revealed a level of cold manipulation that shocked even his longtime supporters. When the day's proceedings concluded, the damage to Dumbledore's reputation was catastrophic and irreversible. The wizard who had been revered as the protector of the innocent stood exposed as someone who had systematically abused the most vulnerable child in the wizarding world for his own political purposes. But more than Dumbledore's personal disgrace, Harry's appearance had announced the emergence of a new power in magical Britain. Here was someone with the magical strength to back up his convictions, the legal authority to pursue his agenda, and the financial resources to challenge established institutions. The old order, built on the assumption that children should be seen and not heard, that power should be wielded by a small group of elderly wizards, and that the ends justified any means, was about to face its first serious challenge in generations. As Harry left the ministry that evening, surrounded by goblin guards who treated him as an equal rather than a ward to be protected, he reflected on how completely his life had changed. Just weeks earlier, he had been a powerless victim with no hope of justice or independence. Now he was the catalyst for a revolution that would reshape the wizarding world's understanding of power, responsibility, and justice. The legal proceedings were far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Dumbledore would face the consequences of his crimes, the institutions he had corrupted would be held accountable, and the wizarding world would be forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how power had been abused in their name. But perhaps most importantly, Harry Potter had announced himself as someone who would no longer accept the world as it was. He had the power to change it, the allies to support him, and the determination to see justice done. The revolution had begun, and there would be no turning back. The aftermath of Harry's public testimony created ripple effects throughout magical Britain that extended far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Within hours of the Daily Prophet's detailed coverage hitting the streets, Harry found himself at the center of a political maelstrom that would fundamentally reshape the balance of power in the wizarding world. The first sign that everything had changed came in the form of an unexpected visitor to the Goblin safe house. Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, arrived under cover of darkness with a small escort of her most trusted aurors. Her presence alone was significant, but the request she brought was unprecedented. Director Bones was a formidable woman in her 50s, with steel-grey hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested she had seen too much corruption and was determined to root out more. Her reputation for incorruptible integrity made her one of the few ministry officials that even the goblins respected, and her decision to involve herself personally in Harry's case sent a clear message to the wizarding world's power brokers. "Lord Potter," she said formally, as she settled into the secure conference room deep beneath Diagon Alley. "I have come to offer the full support of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement in your case against Albus Dumbledore. More than that, I want to discuss the implications of what you have revealed for the broader integrity of our magical government." Harry studied the older woman carefully, using the enhanced magical senses that his goblin training had developed. Her magical signature radiated the kind of controlled power that marked her as someone who had survived decades in magical law enforcement. But more importantly, it carried no trace of deception or hidden agenda. "Director Bones," Harry replied with the formal courtesy that had become second nature, "I appreciate your support, but I must ask why you are willing to risk your position by opposing Dumbledore so openly." Amelia's expression hardened. "Because the evidence you have presented reveals systematic corruption that goes far beyond one man's crimes, no matter how heinous. If the chief warlock of the Wizengamot has been stealing from orphaned children and using that money to fund his own political organization, it raises questions about every decision he has influenced over the past decade." She spread out a collection of documents that made Harry's pulse quicken with anticipation. Her investigation had uncovered a pattern of suspicious decisions, questionable resource allocations, and convenient legal rulings that suggested Dumbledore's corruption extended throughout the magical government. "The Order of Phoenix," she continued, "has been operating as an illegal paramilitary organization without ministry oversight or authorization. Its funding, which we now know came from your stolen inheritance, has been used to recruit ministry employees, conduct unsanctioned operations, and influence policy decisions at the highest levels of government." But Director Bones had uncovered something even more disturbing. Her investigation revealed that Dumbledore had been systematically identifying and monitoring other magically powerful children, using his positions of authority to gain access to their medical records, family histories, and inheritance documents. Harry was not the only victim of Dumbledore's manipulations. He was simply the most valuable target in a decades-long campaign to control and exploit the most promising members of each new generation of wizards. As Harry absorbed this information, he felt his anger transforming into something colder and more dangerous. The scope of Dumbledore's crimes was even greater than the goblins had suspected, and the implications for magical society were staggering. The second major development came from an unexpected quarter. Representatives of the ancient pureblood families, the very people Harry had been taught to despise as dark wizard sympathizers, began requesting private meetings to discuss potential alliances. The first to approach him was Cyrus Greengrass, head of one of the oldest and most respected magical bloodlines in Britain. Unlike the stereotypical image of pureblood supremacists, Greengrass proved to be a sophisticated political thinker who understood that Harry's emergence as an independent power represented both opportunity and threat. "Lord Potter," Greengrass said as they met in a neutral location arranged by the goblins, "your recent revelations have forced many of us to reconsider our assumptions about power and its proper use in magical society. We find ourselves in the unusual position of agreeing with your criticism of the current establishment." Greengrass explained that the old pureblood families had actually been marginalized by Dumbledore's political maneuvering over the past several decades. Their traditional influence had been systematically eroded by a man who claimed to champion equality while building his own power base through manipulation and theft. More significantly, Greengrass brought his daughter Daphne to the meeting, and Harry found himself face to face with someone who would become far more important to his future than he could have imagined. Daphne Greengrass was Harry's age, but carried herself with the poise and intelligence of someone much older. Her magical signature was strong and precisely controlled, suggesting excellent training and natural talent. But it was her eyes that captured Harry's attention, sharp with the kind of analytical intelligence that recognized the significance of what was happening around them. "Lord Potter," she said, with perfect formal courtesy, "I wanted to meet the person who has managed to challenge the most powerful wizard in Britain and expose him as a fraud. That requires either extraordinary courage or extraordinary foolishness, and I was curious to determine which. Harry found himself genuinely intrigued by Daphne's directness. Most people his age either feared him or tried to curry favor with him, but she approached him as an equal, worthy of honest evaluation. "I hope you will conclude it was courage, Miss Greengrass," Harry replied with a slight smile, "though I admit there have been moments when I questioned my own judgment." Their conversation, which was supposed to be a brief, formal introduction, extended for hours as they discussed magical theory, political strategy, and their shared frustration with the corruption they saw throughout wizarding society. Harry found that Daphne possessed not only keen intelligence, but also a moral clarity that complemented his own sense of justice. By the end of their meeting, Harry understood that he had found something he had never expected, a peer who could match his intellectual development and shared his vision for reforming the wizarding world. But the political maneuvering was only beginning. The revelation of Dumbledore's crimes had created a power vacuum that multiple factions were attempting to fill, and Harry found himself courted by groups whose support came with complex obligations and expectations. The most surprising approach came from Severus Snape, the potions master at Hogwarts, and a man whose reputation for cruelty and dark wizard sympathies made him seem an unlikely ally. Snape's arrival at the Goblin safe house was so unexpected that the guards nearly attacked him before Harry intervened. "Potter," Snape said in his characteristic drawl, though his usual contempt was notably absent, "I have come to discuss certain information that has recently come to light regarding Dumbledore's manipulation of my own circumstances." The conversation that followed was one of the most shocking revelations in a case already full of them. Snape revealed that his service to Dumbledore had been secured through magical coercion rather than genuine loyalty. Life debts, binding magical oaths, and threats against people he cared about had trapped him in a position where he had no choice but to serve Dumbledore's agenda. More significantly, Snape possessed detailed knowledge of Dumbledore's long-term plans, including the manipulation of Harry's life from birth through his expected death in a confrontation with Voldemort. The potions master's testimony would provide crucial evidence of premeditation and conspiracy that would ensure Dumbledore faced the most serious possible charges. But perhaps most important of all, Snape's defection signaled that even Dumbledore's most trusted agents were beginning to abandon him as the scope of his crimes became clear. The third major development involved the international magical community, which had been watching the unfolding scandal with considerable interest. Representatives from the French Ministry of Magic, the German Magical Council, and even the International Confederation of Wizards began making discreet inquiries about Harry's future plans and potential availability for consultation on magical law reform. The international attention served multiple purposes. It provided Harry with potential allies beyond Britain's borders, created diplomatic pressure for a thorough investigation of the charges against Dumbledore, and established Harry as a figure of global significance rather than simply a domestic political curiosity. But it was the emergence of other victims that truly transformed Harry's case from a personal quest for justice into a movement for systemic reform. Following the publicity surrounding Harry's testimony, other young wizards began coming forward with their own stories of manipulation and exploitation by Dumbledore and his associates. Neville Longbottom revealed that his magical development had also been artificially suppressed, apparently to prevent him from becoming a rival to Harry's prophesied importance. Luna Lovegood provided evidence that her father's newspaper had been subject to systematic harassment and sabotage whenever it attempted to publish stories that contradicted Dumbledore's preferred narrative. The pattern of suppression extended to multiple independent media outlets, creating a de facto censorship system that protected Dumbledore's reputation. Most shocking of all was the testimony of several former Hogwarts students who revealed that Dumbledore had been monitoring and influencing their career choices, personal relationships, and political affiliations long after their graduation. The school's alumni network had been converted into an intelligence and influence operation that extended Dumbledore's control throughout magical society. As evidence accumulated of a conspiracy that involved dozens of accomplices and affected hundreds of victims, Harry realized that his individual case had become the catalyst for exposing systematic corruption that had plagued magical Britain for decades. The transformation of public opinion was swift and decisive. The wizard who had been revered as the defeater of dark wizards and protector of the innocent stood revealed as the architect of a system of manipulation and control that rivaled anything attributed to the dark wizards he claimed to oppose. But perhaps most significantly, Harry's emergence as a powerful, independent force had inspired others to question the assumptions and authority structures that had previously gone unchallenged. Young wizards who had been taught to defer to their elders were demanding explanations for policies and practices that served the interests of the powerful at the expense of everyone else. The political implications were staggering. If Dumbledore could fall from grace so completely, what other respected figures might be hiding similar secrets? If the chief warlock of the Wizengamot had been systematically corrupt, how could anyone trust the legal system he had helped shape? As Harry prepared for the next phase of the legal proceedings, he understood that he had become something far more significant than a victim seeking justice. He had become the symbol of a new generation that refused to accept corruption and manipulation as the price of stability. The wizarding world was experiencing its first real political upheaval in generations, and Harry Potter was at the center of it all. But with great power came great responsibility, and Harry was beginning to understand that his actions would have consequences that extended far beyond his personal quest for justice. The alliances he forged, the policies he supported, and the precedents he established would shape magical society for generations to come. The revolution was no longer coming. It had arrived, and Harry Potter was leading it. As he stood in the secure conference room, surrounded by allies who had once been strangers, Harry reflected on how completely his life had changed. From an abused child with no hope of justice, he had become a political force capable of challenging the most powerful institutions in the wizarding world. But the real test was still to come. Dumbledore would not surrender his power without a fight, and the forces that had benefited from the old system of corruption and manipulation would not give up their advantages easily. The battle for the soul of magical Britain was about to begin, and Harry Potter intended to win it decisively. The old world was ending, and a new one was being born. The only question was what kind of world it would be, and Harry was determined to ensure it would be one where justice, truth, and accountability were more than just empty words. The future of magic itself was at stake, and Harry Potter had become its unlikely champion. The counterattack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning, swift and brutal and desperate in the way of cornered predators who finally understand that their time is running out. Albus Dumbledore, stripped of his political protections and facing the collapse of everything he had built over decades of careful manipulation, made the decision that would transform a legal proceeding into open warfare. Harry woke to the sound of alarm bells echoing through the Goblin warrens beneath Gringotts, their urgent bronze voices announcing that the ancient bank was under direct assault for the first time in its 1,000-year history. The magical wards that protected the deepest vaults were screaming warnings of unauthorized intrusion, and the very stones beneath his feet vibrated with the impact of powerful magic being wielded in anger. Ironhide burst into Harry's chambers without ceremony, his scarred face grim with battle-ready determination. The Goblin warrior was fully armed and armored, carrying weapons that hummed with contained magical energy and wearing protective enchantments that made the air around him shimmer like heat waves. "Lord Potter," Ironhide said with urgent efficiency, "Dumbledore has invoked emergency guardianship powers and is attempting to breach our sovereign territory with a force of Aurors and Order members. He claims you have been kidnapped and subjected to dark magic influence." Harry felt ice settle in his veins as the full implications became clear. Dumbledore was not simply fighting the legal charges against him. He was making a desperate play to regain physical control over Harry, betting everything on his ability to portray himself as a rescuer rather than a criminal. The strategy was brilliant in its audacity and terrifying in its potential consequences. If Dumbledore could seize Harry and claim he had been rescued from Goblin manipulation, the entire legal case could be dismissed as the product of dark magic influence. Harry would once again become a helpless pawn, and the evidence of Dumbledore's crimes would be buried beneath claims of Goblin conspiracy. But Dumbledore had made a critical miscalculation. In attacking Gringotts directly, he had committed an act of war against a sovereign magical nation, one with its own military traditions and no tolerance for wizard aggression. As Harry donned the protective gear that Goblin craftsmen had prepared for exactly this possibility, he could hear the sounds of battle echoing through the corridors above. The clash of steel on steel mixed with the thunderous impacts of offensive spells, and the very air crackled with magical energies unleashed in quantities that would have been unimaginable in civilian settings. The Goblin response was everything their reputation suggested, and more. Centuries of warrior tradition had prepared them for exactly this kind of conflict, and they met the wizard assault with tactics and weapons that their enemies had never encountered before. Harry emerged into the main battleground to find organized chaos that resembled nothing so much as a medieval siege transported into the modern magical world. Dumbledore's forces had breached the outer defenses of Gringotts and were attempting to fight their way deeper into the bank, but they were discovering that goblins had advantages on their home territory that no wizard had fully appreciated. The corridors themselves fought against the intruders. Passages sealed themselves behind advancing wizards, cutting off retreat routes and dividing their forces. Floors became quicksand beneath unwary feet, and walls sprouted blade-sharp protrusions that turned simple movement into life-threatening navigation. But it was the Goblin warriors themselves who provided the most shocking revelation for the attacking wizards. These were not the diminutive bankers that wizard society had dismissed as irrelevant to serious magical conflict. These were professional soldiers with centuries of experience, wielding weapons forged with techniques that predated wizard civilization and enhanced with battle magic that made their every blow devastating. Harry watched in fascination as Goblin tactics systematically dismantled the wizard assault. Where wizards relied on individual dueling skills and dramatic gestures, Goblins fought as coordinated units with overlapping fields of fire and mutual support systems that left no opening unexploited. The weapons the Goblins carried were works of art as much as instruments of war. Swords that could cut through magical shields as easily as flesh, crossbows that fired bolts of crystallized magic capable of punching through the strongest protective enchantments, and armor that redirected hostile spells back at their casters with compound interest. But perhaps most impressive of all was the discipline and coordination the Goblin forces displayed under pressure. Every movement was purposeful, every tactic precisely executed, and every decision made with the kind of cold strategic thinking that had allowed their civilization to survive and prosper despite centuries of wizard oppression. As the battle raged around him, Harry began to understand why the Goblin nation had been so confident in offering him their protection. This was not simply a banking institution with pretensions to military capability. This was a warrior culture that had been preparing for exactly this confrontation for generations. The turning point came when Dumbledore himself entered the battle, his magical power blazing like a controlled star as he carved a path through Goblin defenses that had held against everything else his forces could bring to bear. The old wizard moved with the fluid grace of someone who had been fighting magical duels since before Harry was born, and his spells struck with the kind of devastating precision that reminded everyone present why he was considered the most powerful wizard of his generation. But Dumbledore's dramatic entrance also provided Harry with the opportunity he had been waiting for. This was no longer a legal proceeding or political maneuvering. This was direct confrontation between the forces of corruption and those seeking justice, and Harry intended to make his position unmistakably clear. Stepping into the main corridor where Dumbledore was advancing, Harry raised his staff and let his own magical power blaze forth with an intensity that brought the entire battle to a momentary halt. The raw force of his unbound abilities sent shockwaves through the stone around him, and his voice carried clearly over the din of combat. "Albus Dumbledore," Harry called out with formal precision, "you stand accused of theft, fraud, child abuse, and now armed assault on a sovereign magical nation. Surrender yourself for trial, or face the consequences of your actions." The old wizard's response was everything Harry had expected and dreaded. Instead of acknowledging the legitimacy of the charges against him or attempting to justify his actions through legal channels, Dumbledore raised his wand with clear intent to attack a child he claimed to be protecting. "Harry Potter," Dumbledore said, in a voice that carried centuries of assumed authority, "you have been corrupted by dark influences and subjected to magical manipulation. I am here to rescue you from those who would use you for their own purposes." The hypocrisy was breathtaking even by Dumbledore's standards. The man who had stolen Harry's inheritance, arranged for his abuse, and magically bound his natural abilities, was claiming to rescue him from manipulation by the very people who had freed him from those constraints. But more than hypocrisy, Dumbledore's words revealed the fundamental arrogance that had driven all of his crimes. He genuinely believed that his intentions justified any action, that his vision of the greater good excused any amount of individual suffering, and that no one else was qualified to make decisions about Harry's life or future. The magical duel that followed was unlike anything the wizarding world had seen in living memory. This was not the formal, rule-bound combat taught at Hogwarts or practiced in ministry training programs. This was warfare between two individuals whose power levels transcended normal magical categories. Dumbledore fought with the accumulated skill and knowledge of nearly 2 centuries of magical study. His spells were masterworks of precision and power, crafted with the kind of theoretical understanding that only came from decades of advanced research. He wielded magic like a master craftsman, using tools that had been perfected through long practice. But Harry fought with something that all of Dumbledore's knowledge and experience could not replicate: the fury of someone who had been betrayed by the person who should have protected him, combined with magical abilities that had been enhanced rather than constrained by his recent training. The goblin magic he had learned was fundamentally different from wizard spellcasting. Where wizard magic sought to impose order and control on chaotic forces, goblin magic worked with natural energies and amplified them through focused will. The result was combat techniques that were more adaptable, more efficient, and ultimately more devastating than anything taught in traditional wizard schools. Harry's first barrage of attacks demonstrated the gap between theory and practice in magical combat. His spells struck with the kind of raw power that Dumbledore had not expected from someone so young. But more importantly, they followed patterns that the old wizard did not recognize and could not predict. Dumbledore's defensive strategies, honed through decades of dueling experience, proved inadequate against techniques that operated according to different theoretical frameworks. His shields, designed to deflect wizard magic, were overwhelmed by forces that struck from unexpected angles and with intensities that exceeded their design parameters. But it was Harry's strategic thinking that truly caught Dumbledore off guard. This was not a child lashing out in emotional fury, but a trained warrior implementing tactical concepts that had been refined by goblin military theorists over centuries of conflict. Harry used the environment to his advantage, turning the stone corridors of Gringotts into weapons that could be manipulated through earth magic. He employed deception and misdirection, creating multiple targeting opportunities while concealing his true intentions. Most effectively, he fought with the kind of controlled aggression that maximized damage while minimizing exposure to counterattack. The duel raged through multiple levels of the bank, leaving destruction in its wake that would take months to repair. Walls cracked under the impact of deflected spells, floors were torn apart by magical forces too powerful for the architecture to contain, and the very air itself became charged with residual energies that made breathing difficult for anyone not directly involved in the combat. But as the battle progressed, it became increasingly clear that Harry held advantages that Dumbledore could not overcome through skill or experience alone. His youth gave him physical endurance that the elderly wizard lacked. His unbound magical core provided him with power reserves that seemed inexhaustible, and his goblin training had prepared him for exactly this kind of extended combat. More importantly, Harry was fighting for principles that gave his magic additional strength. He was not seeking personal advantage or political power, but justice for crimes that had been committed against him and others. That moral clarity translated into magical force that struck with the kind of devastating precision that could only be achieved when power was wielded in service of righteous purpose. The end came suddenly and decisively. Dumbledore, his magical reserves depleted by prolonged combat and his defensive options exhausted by Harry's relentless assault, made the mistake of attempting one final desperate gambit. He tried to cast the killing curse, apparently believing that eliminating Harry would solve all of his problems and allow him to craft whatever narrative suited his purposes. But the killing curse was exactly the wrong choice of spell to use against Harry Potter. His blood protection, his natural magical resistance, and his family's ancient defenses all combined to not only deflect the curse, but redirect it back at its caster with amplified force. Dumbledore's own killing curse struck him with the power of his original intent, multiplied by Harry's defensive magic. The old wizard fell instantly, his body hitting the stone floor with the finality of someone whose long life of manipulation and betrayal had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. The silence that followed was profound and somehow cleansing. The most powerful wizard of his generation lay dead, brought down not by a dark lord or an ancient curse, but by a 9-year-old boy who had refused to remain a victim. As the sounds of battle faded throughout the rest of Gringotts, Harry stood over Dumbledore's body and felt something that might have been satisfaction mixed with profound relief. The man who had stolen his childhood, his inheritance, and his freedom would never hurt him or anyone else again. But more than personal vindication, Dumbledore's death represented the end of an era of corruption and manipulation that had poisoned the wizarding world for decades. The institutions and individuals who had enabled his crimes would now face investigation and accountability without his protection. The revolution that had begun with Harry's legal case had reached its logical conclusion. The old order was truly dead, and a new one could finally begin to emerge. As goblin warriors secured the battlefield and began cataloguing the evidence of Dumbledore's final crimes, Harry reflected on how completely the world had changed. This morning, he had been a legal plaintiff, seeking justice through established channels. Tonight, he was the person who had ended one of the most powerful magical careers in recorded history. The wizarding world would never be the same, and Harry Potter had made sure of it. Justice, it seemed, sometimes required a sword as much as a scale. The aftermath of Albus Dumbledore's death sent shockwaves throughout the wizarding world that would reshape magical society for generations to come. Within hours of the battle at Gringotts, the entire structure of political power in magical Britain began to collapse as the full extent of his crimes was finally exposed without his influence to suppress or distort the evidence. The formal trial that convened 3 days after Dumbledore's death was unprecedented in both scope and consequence. The full Wizengamot, supplemented by international magical law experts and goblin legal observers, gathered in the largest courtroom available to hear testimony that would reveal decades of systematic corruption, manipulation, and abuse. Harry found himself at the center of proceedings that felt more like a historical reckoning than a simple criminal trial. The evidence that Bloodbane and his team presented painted a picture of institutional failure so comprehensive that many observers struggled to accept its full implications. The first revelation came from Dumbledore's private papers, seized from his office immediately after his death and examined under the strictest magical authentication protocols. These documents, written in Dumbledore's own hand and bearing his personal magical signature, contained detailed plans for manipulating not just Harry's life, but the entire trajectory of wizarding society. The papers revealed that Dumbledore had been orchestrating political events for over 50 years, using his reputation as a force for good to mask activities that would have been considered criminal if undertaken by anyone else. Wars had been prolonged to serve his strategic objectives. Promising young wizards had been deliberately corrupted or eliminated to prevent them from challenging his authority, and entire magical communities had been sacrificed to maintain the illusion of his moral leadership. But perhaps most shocking of all was the discovery of Dumbledore's ultimate plan for Harry himself. The documents showed that he had always intended for Harry to die in a confrontation with Voldemort, viewing the boy's death as an acceptable price for eliminating a dark wizard who had become inconveniently powerful. The plan was laid out with chilling, clinical precision. Harry would be raised in abuse and isolation to make him grateful for any kindness, magically bound to ensure he could never become truly powerful, and psychologically conditioned to view self-sacrifice as noble and necessary. When the time came, he would walk willingly to his death, believing he was saving others. The courtroom fell silent as these revelations were read aloud. Here was documentary evidence that the wizarding world's greatest champion had been planning the murder of an innocent child from the moment that child was born. But the documents were only the beginning of what the investigation had uncovered. Under Veritaserum, a truth serum that compelled complete honesty, dozens of Dumbledore's former associates provided testimony that revealed the scope of his manipulation network. Members of the Order of Phoenix admitted to following orders they had known were morally questionable. Ministry officials confessed to altering records and suppressing investigations at Dumbledore's request, and Hogwarts staff revealed years of systematic abuse and neglect that had been covered up to protect the school's reputation. The testimony of Severus Snape proved particularly damaging to Dumbledore's posthumous reputation. Under the influence of truth serum, Snape revealed that his loyalty to Dumbledore had been secured through a combination of magical coercion, blackmail, and threats against people he cared about. Dumbledore had discovered Snape's role in the deaths of Harry's parents, and used that knowledge to force him into decades of unwilling service. Rather than seeking justice for the betrayal that had led to the Potter's murder, Dumbledore had chosen to exploit Snape's guilt as a means of controlling a powerful and potentially useful agent. The revelation that Dumbledore had known the identity of the person responsible for his supposed friends' deaths and had chosen to protect that person for his own purposes was met with audible gasps of outrage from the assembled crowd. But it was the testimony of the other victims that truly demonstrated the systematic nature of Dumbledore's crimes. Neville Longbottom, his grandmother Augusta beside him for support, testified about the magical suppression spells that had been placed on him as a child. Like Harry, Neville had been deliberately weakened to prevent him from fulfilling his potential, though for different strategic reasons. The prophecy that had marked Harry as Voldemort's enemy could have applied equally to Neville, and Dumbledore had apparently decided to eliminate that ambiguity by ensuring that Neville would never be powerful enough to challenge anyone. The magical bindings placed on him were even more comprehensive than those used on Harry, designed not just to limit his abilities, but to make him appear almost magically incompetent. The testimony revealed that Neville's apparent clumsiness and academic struggles had been artificially imposed, part of a deliberate campaign to destroy his confidence and ensure he would never question authority or seek to improve his position in magical society. Luna Lovegood provided evidence of a different kind of systematic oppression. Her father's newspaper, The Quibbler, had been subject to harassment, magical sabotage, and economic pressure whenever it attempted to publish stories that contradicted official narratives or questioned popular assumptions. The pattern of suppression extended to other independent media outlets, creating an information control system that allowed Dumbledore and his allies to shape public opinion while suppressing inconvenient truths. Journalists who asked difficult questions found themselves unable to get their stories published. Sources who provided sensitive information discovered their identities had been leaked to hostile parties, and publications that refused to cooperate faced mysterious accidents and financial difficulties. Most chilling of all was the testimony of former Hogwarts students who had shown exceptional magical potential during their school years. One after another, they described how their career opportunities had been limited, their personal relationships manipulated, and their life choices influenced by subtle and not so subtle pressure from authority figures connected to Dumbledore. Brilliant young wizards had found themselves steered away from positions of influence, prevented from forming alliances with each other, and gradually isolated from networks of power and information. Those who had resisted these pressures had faced increasingly serious consequences, including false criminal charges, social ostracism, and in several cases, mysterious accidents that had ended their careers or their lives. The picture that emerged was of a systematic campaign to prevent any wizard of Harry's generation from accumulating enough power, knowledge, or influence to challenge the established order. Dumbledore had not simply been manipulating Harry's life, he had been shaping the entire magical world to ensure that no one could ever threaten his position as the ultimate authority. As witness after witness provided testimony under magical compulsion, the courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense. These were not allegations or accusations that could be dismissed as the fantasies of disgruntled individuals. This was sworn testimony under truth serum from dozens of credible witnesses, supported by documentary evidence that had been authenticated by the most advanced magical forensics available. The international magical law experts who had been observing the proceedings began to express concern about the implications of what they were hearing. If similar patterns of corruption existed in other magical governments, the entire foundation of international magical cooperation could be called into question. But perhaps most significantly, the testimony revealed the existence of other children who had suffered treatment similar to Harry's. Orphaned magical children whose inheritances had been looted, whose magical development had been suppressed, and whose life opportunities had been deliberately limited to serve the interests of adults who claimed to be protecting them. The scope of the crimes was so vast that the Wizengamot was forced to establish special investigative committees just to catalogue all the victims and document the full extent of the damage that had been done to magical society. As the evidence mounted, public opinion shifted with stunning speed and finality. The wizard who had been revered as the defeater of dark lords and the protector of the innocent stood exposed as someone whose crimes rivaled anything attributed to the dark wizards he had claimed to oppose. The Daily Prophet, which had initially been reluctant to criticize such a respected figure, was now running headlines that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Dumbledore, the Dark Lord. We never knew, and systematic child abuse, the truth about our heroes, dominated the front pages of every magical newspaper in Britain. But more than public outrage, the revelations were forcing fundamental changes in how magical society understood power and its proper use. The assumption that good intentions justified any means was being challenged by people who had experienced the consequences of that philosophy firsthand. Harry, watching the proceedings from his position as the primary victim and key witness, felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. He had wanted justice for the crimes committed against him, and he was certainly getting that. But seeing the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulation network revealed how many people had suffered unnecessarily while the wizarding world celebrated the man responsible for their pain. The trial also revealed the extent to which Harry's case had catalyzed broader changes in magical society. Young wizards who had previously accepted their limited opportunities and constrained lives were now demanding explanations and seeking to reclaim their stolen potential. Parents were questioning the educational practices at Hogwarts and other magical schools, wondering what other forms of systematic abuse might be hidden behind claims of traditional teaching methods and necessary discipline. Ministry employees were coming forward with evidence of corruption and illegal activities they had witnessed but been afraid to report, knowing that the protection Dumbledore had provided to his network was no longer available. Most significantly, the magical creatures who had been marginalized and oppressed by wizard society were beginning to organize and demand recognition of their rights and interests. The Goblins' successful defense of their sovereignty during the battle at Gringotts had demonstrated that wizard dominance was not inevitable, and other magical communities were taking note. As the formal trial proceedings concluded, it became clear that Dumbledore's death had marked the end of more than just one man's criminal career. It had ended an entire era of magical history, one characterized by the assumption that a small group of powerful wizards should make decisions for everyone else without accountability or oversight. The new era that was beginning would be shaped by different principles: transparency rather than secrecy, accountability rather than assumed authority, and justice rather than political convenience. Harry Potter, the primary catalyst for these changes, found himself in the unprecedented position of being both the victim whose suffering had exposed the corruption and the hero whose courage had ended it. But more than that, he was increasingly seen as the symbol of a new generation that would not accept the failures and compromises of their predecessors. The wizarding world was experiencing its first genuine revolution in centuries, and Harry Potter had become its unlikely but undeniable leader. But with that leadership came responsibilities that extended far beyond his personal quest for justice. The institutions that had failed him and so many others would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. The victims of systematic abuse and manipulation would need support and resources to rebuild their lives. And most challengingly, a magical society that had been shaped by centuries of authoritarian control would need to learn how to govern itself according to principles of democracy and individual rights. The trial had ended, but the real work of transformation was just beginning. As Harry left the courtroom that day, surrounded by allies who had once been strangers and facing a future that was simultaneously full of promise and uncertainty, he reflected on how completely his life had changed since that day in the Dursley attic, when he had first discovered the truth about his inheritance. He had sought justice for crimes committed against him, and he had achieved that beyond his wildest hopes. But in the process, he had also become the catalyst for changes that would reshape the magical world for generations to come. The scared little boy who had lived in a cupboard was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that power came with the responsibility to use it wisely and justly. The revolution was no longer coming. It had arrived, and Harry Potter was leading it toward a future that would be defined by the choices he and his generation made in the days and years ahead. The old world was truly dead, and the new one was being born in courtrooms and conference chambers, in the pages of newspapers and the conversations of ordinary wizards who were finally free to speak truth to power without fear of retribution. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the foundations had been laid for a magical society where such injustices could never happen again. The world that Harry Potter inherited in the wake of Dumbledore's downfall was both exhilarating and terrifying in its possibilities. With the old wizard's death and the complete exposure of his crimes, the entire power structure of magical Britain had collapsed like a house of cards, leaving behind a vacuum that multiple parties were eager to fill. But none were better positioned to shape what came next than the 9-year-old boy who had brought down the most powerful wizard of his generation. The first indication of just how completely things had changed came when Harry gained full access to his inheritance. The Potter family vaults, unsealed by Goblin authorities, now that all legal obstacles had been removed, contained wealth that exceeded even the most optimistic estimates. But more than gold and precious stones, the vaults held artifacts, books, and magical items that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and power. The Potter ancestral home, revealed through documents found in the deepest vault, proved to be a sprawling estate in the Scottish Highlands that had been hidden from the wizarding world for over 2 decades. Protected by wards that made it invisible to magical detection and unplottable by conventional means, the property represented not just a place to live, but a stronghold from which to rebuild his life and plan for the future. Harry's first sight of Potter Manor took his breath away. The castle, for that was what it truly was, rose from the Highland mists like something from a fairy tale. Ancient stone towers reached toward the sky, connected by graceful bridges and surrounded by gardens that had maintained themselves through decades of abandonment thanks to powerful preservation charms. But it was what lay beneath the castle that truly demonstrated the scope of his inheritance. The Potter family had maintained their own library, laboratory, training facilities, and workshop spaces that rivaled anything at Hogwarts. Centuries of magical research, combat techniques, and theoretical innovations had been preserved in perfect condition, waiting for the day when a Potter heir would return to claim them. As Harry walked through rooms that his father had once inhabited, he felt a connection to his family's history that went far beyond simple ownership of property. These were the spaces where generations of Potters had studied, trained, and prepared for the responsibilities that came with their bloodline's power and influence. The family grimoire, now permanently bonded to Harry's magical signature, revealed training regimens and magical techniques that would have been considered revolutionary if they had been known to the broader wizarding world. The Potters had been more than wealthy aristocrats. They had been magical innovators whose work had advanced the theoretical foundations of magic itself. But perhaps most significantly, Harry discovered that his family had anticipated something like Dumbledore's betrayal centuries before it happened. Hidden chambers contained detailed contingency plans for dealing with corrupt magical authorities, alternative power structures that could be activated in times of crisis, and alliances with non-wizard magical communities that had been carefully maintained across generations. The Goblins, it turned out, were only one of several non-human magical nations that had treaty obligations to support Potter family interests. The Centaurs of the Forbidden Forest, the Merpeople of the Scottish Lochs, and even the Dragons of the Welsh Reserves all had ancient agreements that recognized Potter authority in exchange for protection and advocacy within wizard society. Harry was not simply the heir to wealth and property. He was the inheritor of a shadow government that his ancestors had built as insurance against exactly the kind of systematic corruption that Dumbledore had represented. As he settled into his new home, Harry began the intensive magical training that would transform him from a powerful child into someone capable of wielding the full scope of his inheritance. The Potter family training regimens were designed to produce not just skilled wizards, but complete magical practitioners who could operate at the highest levels of magical society. Under the guidance of Goblin trainers, Centaur philosophers, and the preserved instructional materials left by his ancestors, Harry's education expanded far beyond anything taught at Hogwarts. He studied advanced magical theory that treated magic as a fundamental force of nature rather than a collection of discrete spells. He learned combat techniques that integrated physical conditioning, mental discipline, and magical power into a seamless whole. Most importantly, he began to understand the political and social responsibilities that came with his position. The Potter family had never been content to simply accumulate wealth and power for its own sake. They had seen themselves as guardians of magical society's moral and ethical development, with obligations to protect those who could not protect themselves and to challenge corruption wherever they found it. But Harry was not alone in his new circumstances. The bonds he had formed during his fight against Dumbledore's corruption proved stronger and more meaningful than he had expected, particularly his growing relationship with Daphne Greengrass. Daphne had become a regular visitor to Potter Manor, initially arriving as part of her family's formal alliance with Harry's political agenda, but increasingly staying for personal reasons that had little to do with politics. She proved to be not just intellectually compatible with Harry, but genuinely supportive of his vision for reforming magical society. Their conversations during long walks through the manor's extensive grounds revealed a meeting of minds that went far beyond their shared age and similar backgrounds. Both had been raised with expectations of political involvement and social responsibility. Both had witnessed the failures of the old system firsthand, and both possessed the intelligence and determination necessary to create something better. But their relationship was developing into something deeper than political alliance or intellectual partnership. Harry found himself genuinely caring about Daphne's opinions, seeking her advice on matters both personal and political, and looking forward to her visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with strategy or planning. For her part, Daphne seemed to understand the unique pressures and responsibilities that came with Harry's position, while offering the kind of emotional support that he had never experienced before. She listened without judgment when he struggled with the weight of his newfound power, provided practical advice when he faced difficult decisions, and challenged him intellectually when his thinking needed refinement. Their relationship was complicated by their age and the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together, but it was also strengthened by shared experiences and mutual respect that suggested a foundation strong enough to survive whatever challenges lay ahead. The romantic subplot that was developing between them provided Harry with something he had never had before: a personal life separate from his public responsibilities. In a world where every decision he made had political implications and every action was scrutinized by multiple audiences, Daphne represented a space where he could be simply Harry rather than Lord Potter, the boy who lived, or the catalyst for revolutionary change. But even as Harry was building a personal life and establishing his new home, the broader implications of his victory over Dumbledore continued to reshape magical society in ways that demanded his attention and leadership. The most immediate challenge came from former members of Dumbledore's network who were desperately trying to distance themselves from his crimes while preserving what they could of their own positions and influence. Some, like Professor McGonagall, appeared genuinely remorseful for their complicity in the corruption and were seeking opportunities to make amends. McGonagall's visit to Potter Manor was one of the most emotionally charged encounters of Harry's new life. The stern Transfiguration professor, who had enforced Dumbledore's will for decades, arrived bearing evidence of her own complicity in the systematic abuse Harry had suffered, along with a request for forgiveness that she clearly did not expect to receive. "Harry Potter," she said, with the formal dignity that had always characterized her interactions with students, "I have come to acknowledge my failure in my duty to protect you, and to offer whatever assistance I can in repairing the damage that was done." The conversation that followed revealed the complexity of the situation that many adults had found themselves in during Dumbledore's reign. McGonagall had suspected that something was wrong with Harry's living arrangements and educational development, but she had deferred to Dumbledore's authority and convinced herself that his greater wisdom justified decisions that her own conscience questioned. Her testimony during the trials had revealed the psychological mechanisms through which Dumbledore had maintained control over his subordinates. A combination of genuine respect for his past accomplishments, fear of his political power, and carefully cultivated dependence on his approval had created a system where even well-intentioned people became complicit in activities they would never have supported independently. Harry found himself struggling with how to respond to McGonagall's request for forgiveness. On one hand, she had genuinely failed in her responsibilities and had contributed to years of unnecessary suffering. On the other hand, she had also been a victim of Dumbledore's manipulation, albeit one with more agency and responsibility than most. His decision to offer conditional forgiveness, contingent on her active participation in reforming the educational system that had enabled such abuse, established a pattern that would guide his interactions with other former Dumbledore associates. Those who acknowledged their failures and committed to meaningful change would be given opportunities to redeem themselves. Those who attempted to minimize their responsibility or continue the old patterns would face the full consequences of their actions. But not all of Dumbledore's former allies were seeking redemption. Some were actively working to undermine Harry's growing influence and restore the old system under new leadership. These individuals posed a direct threat to the reforms Harry was trying to implement and required a more decisive response. The most significant challenge came from a coalition of ministry officials, Wizengamot members, and business leaders who had benefited from the corruption Dumbledore had enabled. They could not directly attack Harry, whose public support was too strong and whose legal position was too secure, but they could attempt to sabotage the institutions and reforms he was trying to establish. Their strategy focused on bureaucratic resistance, legal challenges, and economic pressure, designed to make meaningful change impossible without direct confrontation. They hoped to exhaust Harry's resources and patience, while gradually rebuilding the networks of influence and corruption that had served their interests for so long. But they had underestimated both Harry's determination and his resources. The Potter family's centuries of political involvement had taught them how to recognize and counter exactly these kinds of subtle resistance campaigns. More importantly, Harry's alliance with the Goblin nation provided him with financial and intelligence capabilities that his opponents couldn't match. The economic warfare that followed was brief but decisive. When ministry officials attempted to use regulatory pressure to limit Harry's business interests, Goblin accountants revealed financial irregularities in their own operations that forced immediate resignations. When Wizengamot members tried to challenge the legal basis for the trials and reforms, Goblin legal experts produced evidence of additional corruption that implicated the challengers themselves. Most effectively, when business leaders attempted to organize economic boycotts against Harry's interests, the Goblin banking system reminded them that their own financial stability depended on institutions that Harry now had considerable influence over. The message was clear. The old system of corruption and mutual protection was dead, and those who attempted to resurrect it would face consequences that extended far beyond legal proceedings. But Harry's growing power and influence also created opportunities for positive change that went beyond simply punishing those who had wronged him. The reformation of magical society required not just the removal of corrupt individuals, but the creation of new institutions and practices that would prevent similar corruption from taking root in the future. One of Harry's most significant innovations was the establishment of the Potter Foundation, a magical charitable organization dedicated to protecting vulnerable members of magical society and advocating for systemic reform. The Foundation's resources, drawn from Harry's vast inheritance and supported by donations from allies throughout the magical world, were directed toward programs that would have been unthinkable under the old system. The Foundation's first initiative focused on identifying and assisting other children who had suffered abuse or exploitation, similar to what Harry had experienced. Magical orphans, children from families in crisis, and young wizards whose magical development had been artificially suppressed were provided with resources, legal advocacy, and educational opportunities designed to help them reclaim their potential. But the Foundation also addressed broader systemic issues that had enabled individual abuse to flourish unchecked. They funded independent media organizations that could investigate and report on corruption without fear of economic retaliation. They supported legal advocacy groups that could challenge unjust laws and discriminatory practices through the courts. Most importantly, they created educational programs that taught young wizards about their rights and responsibilities as members of magical society. The Foundation's work was revolutionary in its scope and implications. For the first time in magical history, there was an institution with the resources and independence necessary to challenge entrenched power structures and advocate for meaningful change. As Harry reflected on everything that had changed since that day in the Dursley attic, when he first discovered the truth about his inheritance, he realized that his victory over Dumbledore had been only the beginning of a much larger transformation. The scared child who had sought justice for crimes committed against him had become a force for systemic change that was reshaping the entire magical world. But with that transformation had come responsibilities and challenges that would define the rest of his life. The power he had gained through his inheritance and his victory over corruption could be used to create a better world, but only if he wielded it wisely and with constant attention to the moral principles that had guided his initial quest for justice. The revolution was no longer a single event, but an ongoing process that would require continuous vigilance, constant adaptation, and unwavering commitment to the ideals that had inspired it in the first place. Harry Potter had won his war against those who had wronged him, but the battle to create something better in place of what had been destroyed was just beginning. And he intended to win that battle too. The transformation of Harry Potter from victim to revolutionary leader reached its most decisive phase during the autumn of his 10th year, when he made the audacious decision to establish his own independent magical household and begin reshaping wizarding society according to principles that had never been attempted before. The boy who had once lived in a cupboard was about to demonstrate that true power lay not in controlling others, but in creating systems that protected the vulnerable and held the powerful accountable. The first manifestation of Harry's new vision came with his purchase of Grimmauld Place, the ancestral home of the Black family that had been abandoned after Sirius Black's death. The building, located in one of London's most prestigious magical districts, would serve as both his primary residence and the headquarters for the political movement that was coalescing around his leadership. But Harry's approach to renovating the ancient townhouse revealed the fundamental differences between his philosophy and that of the wizarding establishment he was replacing. Rather than simply restoring the building to its former grandeur as a monument to pure-blood supremacy, he transformed it into something entirely new, a center for magical education, political organizing, and social reform that welcomed people regardless of their blood status, species, or social position. The basement levels, once used to house dangerous dark artifacts and family heirlooms of questionable provenance, were converted into secure meeting spaces where representatives from various magical communities could gather without fear of surveillance or interference. The main floors became classrooms and libraries where alternative approaches to magical education could be developed and tested. The upper levels provided comfortable living quarters for the staff and residents who would make the building their home. Most significantly, Harry established what he called Potter's Guard, an elite group of magical protectors who were loyal to him personally, rather than to any institution or government. But unlike traditional bodyguards who simply provided physical security, Potter's Guard was conceived as a new model for magical law enforcement that prioritized protection of the innocent over preservation of existing power structures. The recruitment process for Potter's Guard was revolutionary in its inclusiveness and rigor. Harry actively sought candidates from groups that had been marginalized by traditional wizarding society: Muggle-born wizards whose talents had been overlooked, magical creatures whose abilities had been dismissed, and even reformed dark wizards whose skills could be redirected toward constructive purposes. The first member of Potter's Guard was Remus Lupin, the werewolf who had been one of James Potter's closest friends and who had suffered decades of discrimination due to his lycanthropy. Lupin's recruitment sent a clear message about Harry's intentions. This would be an organization that judged people by their character and abilities rather than by characteristics they could not control. Lupin's acceptance of the position was emotionally charged for both men. The former Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher had been carrying guilt about his failure to protect Harry from Dumbledore's manipulation, while Harry had been wrestling with questions about which of his father's friends could be trusted with knowledge of his true circumstances. "Harry," Lupin said as they met in the newly renovated library at Grimmauld Place, "I failed you as surely as everyone else who should have protected you. I have no right to ask for your trust or your forgiveness." But Harry had learned to distinguish between those who had been complicit in Dumbledore's crimes out of malice and those who had been manipulated into cooperation through more subtle means. Lupin's loyalty to Dumbledore had been secured through a combination of gratitude for his Hogwarts education, financial dependence due to employment discrimination, and carefully cultivated guilt over his perceived failures during the war against Voldemort. "Professor Lupin," Harry replied with the formal courtesy that had become his trademark, "you were as much a victim of Dumbledore's manipulation as I was. The difference is that you now have an opportunity to help ensure that such manipulation never succeeds again." Lupin's integration into Potter's Guard established the template for how the organization would function. Members were expected to be completely loyal to Harry personally, but that loyalty was earned through demonstrated competence, moral integrity, and commitment to the principles of justice and protection that guided the organization's mission. The second recruit was even more controversial: Draco Malfoy, the son of a convicted Death Eater who had surprised everyone by requesting a meeting with Harry shortly after the trials concluded. Malfoy's approach was unexpected and unprecedented. Rather than attempting to justify his family's support for Voldemort or seeking to minimize their crimes, he offered information about remaining Death Eater networks and expressed genuine remorse for the beliefs he had been raised to hold. "Potter," Malfoy said during their first meeting, "I grew up believing that blood purity and wizard supremacy were natural laws that justified any amount of cruelty and oppression. Your victory over Dumbledore has forced me to confront the possibility that everything I was taught was not only wrong, but evil." The conversation that followed revealed a young man who was genuinely struggling to understand how the worldview he had inherited from his family differed from the principles that Harry represented. Malfoy's questions were intelligent and searching, and his willingness to acknowledge the harm caused by his previous beliefs suggested a capacity for genuine reform. Harry's decision to accept Malfoy into Potter's Guard was controversial, even among his closest allies, but it served multiple strategic purposes. It demonstrated that his movement was genuinely committed to redemption and second chances rather than simple revenge. It provided access to intelligence about remaining dark wizard networks that could pose future threats, and most importantly, it established that membership in Potter's Guard was based on present commitment and future potential rather than past mistakes. But the expansion of Potter's Guard beyond human wizards was what truly set it apart from any previous magical organization. Harry's recruitment of goblin warriors, centaur rangers, and even reformed house elves created a genuinely multi-species force that could operate across the boundaries that traditionally divided magical society. The goblin members of Potter's Guard brought combat skills and tactical knowledge that exceeded anything available from wizard sources. Their training methods, weapons technology, and strategic thinking had been refined through centuries of conflict with wizard society, and their integration into Harry's forces represented a fundamental shift in the balance of magical power. The centaurs contributed philosophical guidance and divination abilities that helped inform strategic planning and decision-making. Their understanding of natural magic and long-term historical patterns provided perspectives that purely human thinking often missed. The house elves, freed from their traditional bonds of servitude, but choosing to serve Harry out of genuine loyalty, brought intelligence-gathering capabilities and logistical support that made Potter's Guard far more effective than its size would suggest. Together, these diverse groups formed an organization that was unlike anything the wizarding world had ever seen, a genuine multi-species alliance united around shared principles rather than species-based interests or traditional power structures. But Potter's Guard was only one component of the broader transformation Harry was orchestrating. His establishment of alternative magical education programs represented an even more fundamental challenge to the existing order. The traditional magical education system, centered around Hogwarts and similar institutions, was designed to produce wizards who would fit smoothly into existing social and professional hierarchies. Students learned standardized spells, accepted established theories without question, and were taught to defer to authority figures whose wisdom was presumed to be superior to their own. Harry's educational philosophy was radically different. His schools, established in various locations throughout magical Britain, emphasized critical thinking, practical problem-solving, and moral reasoning that enabled students to make independent judgments about complex ethical issues. Rather than simply memorizing spells and potions recipes, students learned the theoretical principles underlying magical effects so they could develop their own solutions to novel problems. Rather than accepting official narratives about magical history and politics, they were taught to examine primary sources and form their own conclusions based on evidence and logic. Most importantly, students were taught about their rights and responsibilities as members of magical society, including their obligation to resist authority when that authority was being used to cause harm or perpetuate injustice. The curriculum also included subjects that had been completely ignored by traditional magical education: magical creature rights, muggle-born integration, economic theory, political science, and comparative magical systems from other cultures. Students graduated with a comprehensive understanding of magical society that prepared them to be effective advocates for reform rather than passive recipients of established wisdom. The success of these alternative educational programs created demand that far exceeded Harry's ability to meet it through direct provision of services. Parents throughout magical Britain were requesting access to educational approaches that would prepare their children for a world where the old certainties no longer applied and critical thinking was more valuable than unquestioning obedience. Harry's response was to develop a network of affiliated schools and training programs that could implement his educational philosophy on a larger scale. Teachers who had been frustrated by the limitations of traditional magical education were recruited to staff these programs, and standardized curricula were developed that could maintain quality while allowing for local adaptation. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Harry's educational reforms was his establishment of programs specifically designed to help older students and adults who had been failed by the traditional system. Many magical people had been denied educational opportunities due to their blood status, species, or social position, and Harry's programs offered them the chance to develop their potential regardless of their age or background. These adult education initiatives proved particularly popular among magical creatures who had been excluded from formal education entirely, Muggle-born wizards whose talents had been ignored or suppressed, and even reformed dark wizards who were seeking to redirect their abilities toward constructive purposes. The political implications of Harry's educational reforms were staggering. By creating an alternative system that produced graduates who were better informed, more critically minded, and more committed to principles of justice and equality, he was fundamentally changing the character of the next generation of magical leaders. Traditional political parties and interest groups suddenly found themselves dealing with young people who would not simply accept established narratives or defer to conventional authority. These new graduates asked difficult questions, demanded evidence for claims, and insisted on accountability from their leaders in ways that the old system was not equipped to handle. As Harry's influence expanded throughout magical society, he found himself courted by various factions who hoped to gain his support for their own agendas. Some of these approaches came from groups whose goals aligned with his own commitment to reform and justice. Others represented attempts to co-opt his movement for purposes that contradicted everything he stood for. The most significant of these political developments was his growing relationship with the international magical community. Representatives from magical governments around the world had been watching the transformation of British magical society with great interest, and many were beginning to implement similar reforms in their own countries. Harry's first major international speech, delivered to a gathering of magical education ministers from 12 different countries, outlined his vision for a more just and equitable magical world that transcended national boundaries and species divisions. "We stand at a crossroads," Harry told the assembled delegates, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had already proven his ability to transform entrenched systems. "We can continue to accept societies where power is concentrated in the hands of the few and justice is subordinated to political convenience, or we can choose to build institutions that serve all magical beings regardless of their species, background, or beliefs." The response to Harry's international debut was overwhelmingly positive. Delegates from countries that had been struggling with their own problems of corruption and inequality found inspiration in his practical demonstration that meaningful reform was possible even in the face of entrenched opposition. More importantly, Harry's international relationships provided him with allies and resources that extended far beyond the borders of magical Britain. If domestic opponents attempted to suppress his reforms through economic pressure or political maneuvering, he now had international support systems that could provide alternative sources of funding, expertise, and legitimacy. But Harry's growing influence also attracted attention from forces that saw his success as a threat to their own interests. Dark wizards who had escaped prosecution during the post-Voldemort trials, corrupt officials from other magical governments, and The supremacist groups who opposed his inclusive approach to magical society began to organize their own response to what they perceived as a dangerous challenge to the natural order. The first serious attempt to assassinate Harry came during a public appearance at the opening of a new Potter Foundation school in Wales. The attack was sophisticated and well planned, involving multiple assailants using coordination techniques that suggested professional training and significant resources. But the attackers had underestimated both Harry's personal capabilities and the effectiveness of Potter's Guard as a protective force. The multi-species composition of his security detail provided coverage and response capabilities that purely human protection could not have matched. The Goblin warriors detected the magical signatures of concealed weapons and hostile intent before the attack began. The Centaur members of the Guard used their divination abilities to predict the most likely attack vectors and position protective resources accordingly. The House Elf members provided intelligence about the attackers' communications and coordination that allowed for preemptive countermeasures. When the actual attack came, it was met with a coordinated response that neutralized the threat while protecting innocent bystanders and gathering intelligence about the broader conspiracy behind the assassination attempt. Harry's personal role in defending against the attack demonstrated how much his combat abilities had developed since his victory over Dumbledore. His magic was more controlled and precise, his tactical thinking was more sophisticated, and his leadership during crisis situations inspired confidence and effectiveness from everyone around him. But perhaps most significantly, Harry's response to the attack revealed the moral principles that would guide his use of power. Rather than simply eliminating his attackers, he ensured they were captured alive so they could be questioned about the broader conspiracy they represented. Rather than using the attack as justification for increased secrecy or authoritarianism, he used it as an opportunity to demonstrate transparency and accountability in his security operations. The investigation that followed the assassination attempt revealed connections to the same networks of corruption and supremacist ideology that had supported Dumbledore's regime. The attack had not been an isolated incident, but part of a broader campaign to restore the old system by eliminating the person who had become its most effective opponent. Harry's response was swift and decisive. Using the intelligence resources of Potter's Guard and the legal authority he had accumulated through his various official positions, he launched a comprehensive investigation into the remaining networks of corruption and extremism that threatened the stability of the reformed magical society he was building. But rather than conducting these operations in secret or through extrajudicial means, Harry insisted on transparency and legal accountability that would distinguish his methods from those of the enemies he was opposing. Every investigation was conducted according to established legal procedures. Every arrest was made with proper warrants and due process protections, and every prosecution was carried out through legitimate courts with full rights of defense for the accused. The message was clear. The new order Harry was creating would be based on principles of justice and rule of law, rather than the arbitrary exercise of power that had characterized the old system. Even his enemies would be treated with the fairness and respect that they had denied to their own victims. As Harry reflected on everything that had been accomplished in the months since Dumbledore's death, he realized that his personal quest for justice had evolved into something far more significant: the creation of a new model for magical society that could serve as an example for reform movements throughout the world. The scared child who had discovered evidence of theft in a dusty attic had become a transformative leader whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of magical Britain. His success in building institutions based on principles of justice, equality, and accountability had proven that meaningful change was possible even in the face of entrenched opposition and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But Harry also understood that his work was far from finished. The old order had been defeated, but not completely destroyed, and the new institutions he was building would require constant vigilance and continuous development to maintain their effectiveness and moral integrity. The revolution he had started was no longer dependent on his personal leadership, but it still needed his guidance and vision to reach its full potential. The world he was creating would be his lasting legacy, but only if he remained committed to the principles that had inspired it in the first place. As he stood in the renovated library at Grimmauld Place, surrounded by allies who had once been strangers and looking toward a future filled with both promise and uncertainty, Harry Potter knew that he had become something his younger self could never have imagined. Not just a survivor, but a creator of hope for everyone who had ever been told they were powerless to change the world around them.